You stand at the edge of the Mississippi River just before dawn on the outskirts of Muscatine, Iowa, in the quiet years of the early 1890s. The air is cool and still, carrying the clean smell of wet earth and fresh water, with just a faint undertone of distant wood smoke from a stove not yet lit. Beneath your feet, the ground is a mix of packed mud and grass, sloping gently down to the lapping edge of the water, and you feel the slight give of the soil as you shift your weight. Before you, the river stretches wide and flat, a broad ribbon of grey that seems to merge into the darker sky at the far shore, where a line of trees stands as a silhouette without detail. The surface of the water is smooth, not glassy, but with a soft, almost imperceptible texture from the slow push of the current, a movement so gentle that it registers more as a feeling of continuity than as a visible ripple. Above, the sky is beginning to pale in the east, a gradual thinning of the darkness that you notice not all at once, but as a subtle warming of the air, a faint lifting of the heaviness that held the night. There are no clouds, only a scattering of stars that are fading without drama, one by one, as the first light of a sun still below the horizon begins to diffuse across the dome of the world. A thin band of pearl-green light appears along the line where the river meets the sky, and as you watch, it widens almost imperceptibly, turning from grey to a muted silver that catches the surface of the water only in the faintest shimmer. The river does not reflect the light as a mirror would. It absorbs it slowly, the dark hues softening to a deep blue-grey, then to a milkier tone near the edges where the shallows are. There is no sudden change, no moment of transformation, just a steady, patient unfolding of light that you can only perceive by comparing what you see now to what you remember from a few minutes before. To your right, a short wooden pier extends out over the water, its pilings dark with moisture, and tied to it is a flat-bottomed boat that rocks almost imperceptibly with the motion of the river. The boat is simple, painted a dull green that has faded to the color of sage, with a single plank seat across its middle and a pair of long oars resting inside. A man you do not know, a shell gatherer, sits on that seat with his back straight and his hands resting lightly on the oar handles, his face turned toward the eastern light. He wears a broad-brimmed hat of woven straw and a canvas coat the color of river mud, and his stillness makes him part of the scene, as much a feature of the riverbank as the pier or the willows that trail their leaves into the water upstream. He does not look at you. He looks out across the river, waiting for the light to be strong enough to begin his work, and you find yourself breathing in the same slow rhythm that seems to guide his presence. Nothing about the moment calls for speech or action. You simply stand there, noticing the way the air cools the edges of your ears and the inside of your nose with each inhalation, noticing how your own stillness mirrors his. The river itself is not silent. There is a constant low murmur, a sound like a distant whisper that rises not from a single source but from the entire breadth of the current as it moves past the bank, swirling gently around submerged logs and the exposed roots of trees. Close to your feet, where the water is only a few inches deep, you can hear a soft gurgling, a liquid note that repeats in an endless soothing pattern as tiny wavelets fold over a pebble and retreat. Farther out, the sound deepens into a hushed rush, a background hum that holds all the other noises of the morning within it. Somewhere downstream, a bird gives a single, clear caller, repeated note that hangs in the air for a moment, before fading into the general wash of sound. And then another bird answers from the far bank, its voice fainter and slower. These calls are not frequent. They come at long intervals, like the ringing of a distant bell on a quiet Sunday, and between them there is only the river's voice and the occasional creak of the shell-gatherer's boat as it pulls gently against its rope. You turn your gaze back to the water itself, letting your eyes lose focus so that you see not individual details, but the whole expanse of movement. Tiny dimples appear and vanish on the surface, patterns of current that shift like the grain in a piece of polished wood, never repeating exactly. A small twig, carried from somewhere upstream, drifts past in a slow arc, rotating once, twice, before it slips behind the edge of the pier and disappears. Leaves that have fallen from the bank float in small clusters near the edge, moving in place, tugged by invisible threads of water, but never breaking free. The Mississippi here is not a wild river. It runs deep and steady, its force hidden beneath a placid surface, and what you see is only the quiet upper layer of a massive, gentle engine that has been moving for thousands of years. The shell gatherer shifts on his seat, the wood of the boat giving a soft groan, and you see him reach down to adjust something at his feet, a basket, perhaps, or a length of rope. The motion is unhurried, barely more than a ripple in the stillness, and it draws your attention to the purpose of his presence. He is here for the mussels that lie on the riverbed, the heavy, dark shells half buried in silt and sand, filtering the passing current for their own slow sustenance. You have seen their shells before, piled in great heaps outside the button factory on 2nd Street, their rough exteriors dull with dried mud, their insides glinting with the faint, pearly luster that makes them valued. But here, at the source, they are still part of the river, unseen beneath the moving surface, their lives measured not in hours or days, but in the incremental thickening of layers of nacre, each one laid down over months of patient sifting. You think of them resting there in the cool, dim green of the water, their valves slightly open, and the thought settles into your mind with the same quiet weight as the river's flow. The light has continued its slow advance while you have been observing, and now the entire eastern sky is awash of soft gold and pale rose, the colors bleeding into the gray with a delicacy that no painter could ever match. The river catches these colors and transforms them, the gold becoming a hazy sheen on the moving surface, the rose reflected only in the faint blush near the western bank where the water lies smoothest. A thin mist rises from the surface in a few scattered patches, not the heavy fog of autumn, but a light, transparent vapor that hovers just above the water and begins to dissolve as the air warms. The mist moves with the languid grace of a sleeper turning in bed, shifting, thinning, reforming, and the sight of it eases something deep in your chest, a relaxation that comes not from conscious effort, but from simple, absorbed observation. Upstream, at the bend of the river, a second boat appears, pushed along by a man with a long pole standing upright in the stern. He moves with a slow, steady rhythm, planting the pole in the shallows and pushing, then lifting it and letting the water drip from its length before planting it again. The sound of the pole entering the water is a soft plunk, followed by a quiet rush as it displaces a small amount of water, and then a longer silence as the boat glides forward. You watch him approach without any sense of time passing quickly. He seems to be moving across a vast, still painting, his progress so gradual that you can hold his image in your mind, and only notice the change in position when you look away and look back. Eventually he passes behind the screen of willows and is gone, his wake smoothing out within moments, leaving no trace of his passage. The shell gatherer at the pier has untied his rope and settled the oars into the oarlocks. He pulls away from the pier with a gentle stroke, the blades entering the water with a clean, soft splash, and the boat drifts slowly into the current. He does not row hard, he simply places the oars in the water and lets the river do much of the work, adjusting his angle now and then with a slight pull on one side or the other. The boat becomes smaller against the widening light, its green paint blending with the grey-blue of the river, and soon it is just a dark shape on the water, then a speck, then a part of the mist that is rising in the middle of the channel. You watch until you can no longer separate the boat from the rippling surface, and then you let your gaze unfocus once more, taking in the whole river, the whole sky, the whole quiet breath of the morning. Around you, the town of Muscatine is beginning to stir, though the sounds are muffled and distant. A door closes somewhere up the hill, a soft thud that barely reaches you. A horse's hoof clops on cobblestones, once, then several times in a slow walk, and then fades. The smells of the morning shift too, the damp earth giving way to the faint, pleasant scent of coffee brewing somewhere in a kitchen with an open window, and then to the slightly sharper tang of coal smoke as someone stokes a stove. These sensations drift past you without demanding attention, like pages of a book turned by a gentle breeze, and you remain where you are, at the edge of the river, feeling the cool air loosen the tension in your shoulders and along the back of your neck. You have no reason to move. The factory whistle will not blow for another hour, and even then the workday begins with a quiet, measured pace, no rushing, no clamor. You have time to stand here and simply be, to let the river's steady presence fill your senses, to notice the way the air temperature rises by just a degree as the sun's disk finally clears the horizon, a perfect circle of soft gold visible through the thinning mist. The warmth touches your face with the lightness of a feather, and you close your eyes for a long moment, listening. The river's murmur is still there, constant and low, blended with the high, distant cry of a gull and the random, irregular plunk of a fish jumping far out in the current. When you open your eyes again, the light has shifted, the mist has nearly vanished, and the water has taken on a faint greenish hue that speaks of depth and life. Your day has not truly begun yet, not in any hurried sense. It has simply opened, like a door left ajar, inviting you to step through when you are ready. The mud beneath your shoes has dried slightly. The bird song has become a little more frequent, and somewhere to the south a train whistle sounds. A long, low note that carries across the water and fades into the distance like a question left unanswered. The river does not change its pace. It continues to draw its endless, gentle line from north to south, carrying silt and secrets and the quiet lives of mussels down to the Gulf of Mexico far beyond your sight. And you, standing on the bank, are part of that continuity, a still point in a moving world, breathing slowly and thinking of nothing at all but the light on the water and the soft farewell of the shell-gatherer's boat disappearing into the eastern shine. You let your attention sink below the surface of the river, following the imagined descent of a single sinking leaf as it drifts down through the water column, turning and wobbling with a languid grace. The light, so clear and golden at the surface, begins to change almost immediately. The first few inches of water tinted a pale amber by the dissolved tannins of fallen leaves, then deepening into a soft green that thickens as you move lower. By the time you reach the level where the riverbed begins to shape the current, the light has become a diffuse glow, a gentle illumination without a visible source, like the light that filters through old, thick glass. The temperature drops by steady degrees, the way the air cools when you walk into the shade of a large building, until it rests at a constant coolness that never changes, summer or winter, night or day. This is the true home of the freshwater mussels, a world measured not in minutes but in the slow accumulation of years. And here, half buried in the silt and fine sand, the shells rest in their quiet clusters. The riverbed itself is not a flat expanse. It rolls in gentle contours, low hills and shallow valleys, sculpted by the current over centuries, softened further by the blanket of sediment that settles continually from above. The sediment, a mixture of clay particles and organic bits too tiny to see, drifts down endlessly, settling on every surface with the patience of dust in an unused room. In the deeper pockets you would find a filth, almost silky to the touch if you could touch it, while the higher ridges are swept cleaner, revealing patches of gravel worn smooth by the eternal push of water. Scattered across this topography, partly embedded and partly exposed, are the shells themselves, their dark exteriors blending with the mud so perfectly that from a distance they look like nothing more than stones. They lie in groups of varying size, some clusters counting only 3 or 4, others numbering in the dozens, all oriented in the same general direction with their narrower ends pointed into the current, a natural streamlining that the river itself has taught them. The shells are heavy for their size, thick and solid, fashioned from calcium carbonate drawn out of the water and laid down in layers over the soft body within. Their outer surfaces are rough, often stained a deep brown or olive black, sometimes marked with faint ridges that chart the years of growth like the rings of a tree. In some places a thin coating of algae tints them a muted green, and in others the constant friction of moving sand has polished a spot to a dull sheen. You notice the way a few strands of rivergrass wave gently near one cluster, their slender blades bending and straightening in the current with a motion so fluid it seems to erase the boundary between the plant and the water. The two become one continuous movement. The sight of these shells, so still and so enduring, pulls your breathing into an even slower pattern, as if your own body is learning the rhythm of this underwater place. If you were to lift one of these shells, you would feel its weight, the satisfying density of a life that has spent years building itself a home from dissolved minerals, and you would see the hinge, a tough, elastic ligament that holds the two valves together with a constant, unyielding pressure. The mussel inside has no head, no eyes, no voice. It knows the world only through the quality of the water that passes over its gills, and its entire existence is a single, continuous act of filtration. Water enters through an opening at the rear, drawn in by the motion of microscopic cilia beating in unison, and it passes across the gills where oxygen is extracted, and tiny food particles, algae, bacteria, fragments of decaying leaves are caught in a layer of mucus and swept toward the mouth. The cleaned water is then expelled through a second opening, a soft, rhythmic pulsing that never stops, a quiet breathing that goes on through every hour of every day, year after year. In the summer, when the river is warm and full of life, the filtration quickens. In the winter, when the water turns cold and the light is low, it slows to a pace that barely registers, the mussel existing in a state of suspended patience, waiting for the return of warmth. The most remarkable part of the shell, the part that brings the button factory its purpose, is hidden on the inside. If you could open the two valves carefully, separating them along the plane of the hinge, you would reveal a surface that catches the dim underwater light and reflects it back in a shimmer of rainbow colors, a pearlescent lining that seems almost liquid in its beauty. This material is nacre, also called mother of pearl, and it is built layer upon microscopic layer over the mussel's entire life, a continuous secretion that coats the interior and any irritant that might find its way inside. The layers are so thin that thousands of them would be needed to make a sheet as thick as a playing card, and yet the mussel produces them without hurry, one after another, each new layer slightly larger than the last as the shell grows outward from the hinge. The colors you would see in that nacre come not from any pigment, but from the physical structure of the layers themselves, which bend and refract the light into shifting bands of pale pink, soft green, and milky blue, all blending together in a luster that seems to glow from within. You imagine the steady construction of this nacre as a kind of silent calendar, each new layer marking the passage of a season, the warming and cooling of the water, the shifting levels of the river during spring floods and summer droughts. The earliest layers, laid down when the mussel was no larger than a grain of sand and just settling onto the riverbed after its brief larval journey, lie at the very center of the shell, a tiny origin point that you could only see with a magnifying glass. From that center, the shell has expanded outward in concentric rings, each one a record of the conditions under which it was built. Thicker layers, laid down in years of plenty when the algae bloomed heavily in the surface waters, thinner layers corresponding to lean years when the current ran cold, longer than usual. The shell is an archive, a patient history written not in words but in calcium, and it asks nothing of the world except to be left in the cool, dim quiet of the riverbed. Around the clustered shells, other life moves with the same unhurried pace. A small crayfish, its body the color of the surrounding mud, edges sideways across the gravel, its antennae waving in slow arcs to test the water ahead. A tiny fish, a darter, rests on a stone with its pectoral fins splayed like a fan, its gills fluttering rapidly while it holds perfectly still. A thin worm extends from a tube of cemented sand grains, its feathery tentacles catching particles from the passing current with a rhythm that matches the mussel's own filtration. All of these creatures share the same quiet existence, bound together by the flow of the Mississippi that brings them oxygen and food, that carries away their waste, that rocks them gently in its deep, slow pulse. You feel no sense of competition here, no struggle, only the calm, simultaneous presence of living things that have found their place and have no need to hurry. The current above the mussel beds moves differently than at the surface. At the very bottom, friction against the riverbed slows the water to a crawl, creating a thin boundary layer where the flow is almost still, a refuge where fine particles settle and small organisms can rest without being swept away. Just above this layer, the current picks up speed, and you can see, in your mind's eye, the way the water shears past, carrying suspended silt that twinkles faintly when it catches the light. The mussels feel this flow as a constant gentle pressure against their exposed edges, and they have adapted to it over millions of years by anchoring themselves into the sediment with a muscular foot, a pale, fleshy organ that extends downward and pulls the shell deeper into the mud until only the feeding and breathing openings remain above the surface. The foot is not fast. It moves with a slow, gliding extension, testing the sediment, then contracting with a grip that can hold the shell firm even when the river rises and the current strengthens. When the mussel needs to shift position, which it does only rarely and over the course of days, the foot extends forward, pulls the shell a fraction of an inch, and then rests, in a process that has no discernible beginning or end. The light continues its daily cycle even here at the bottom of the river, though the variation is far more subtle than at the surface. As the sun climbs higher in the sky above Muscatine, the glow on the riverbed brightens by just a shade, the greens becoming slightly warmer, the shadows cast by the larger shells sharpening a little before softening again. On a cloudy day, the difference would be almost imperceptible, the whole riverbed bathed in a uniform grey-green light that seems to erase time entirely. But on a clear morning like this one, with the sun breaking through the mist, the light reaches down in slanting columns that sweep slowly across the bottom as the earth turns, like the beam of a lighthouse moving across a floor in an empty room. A cluster of mussels that was in shadow an hour ago now rests in a patch of pale luminescence, the ridges on their shells defined by faint lines of slightly darker algae, and the nacre hidden inside them catches none of this light, yet holds it all in potential, waiting for the day when the shell will be opened and the inner surface revealed. You linger with this image for a long, quiet while, letting it fill your mind the way the river fills its channel. The mussels filter without pause, the silt drifts down, the crayfish moves another inch to the left, the darter flicks its tail and vanishes into a shadow. There is no narrative here, no sequence of events that builds toward a conclusion, only the continual present tense of life on the riverbed, a state of being that predates the town of Muscatine and the factory and the pearl button makers and will continue long after those things are gone. The shells in the factory piles up on the bank are just a tiny fraction of the life that fills the river, a temporary borrowing, and the river itself does not notice the removal any more than a forest notices the fall of a single leaf. This thought, far from being sad, is strangely comforting, a reminder that all the busyness of the world above is held in a larger context of stillness and patience. As you bring your attention slowly back up through the water column, you trace the reverse path of that sinking leaf, watching the light change from the dim green of the bottom to the amber middle waters to the bright silver surface, where the boundary between air and water shimmers like a rippling mirror. The sounds of the world above return gradually, the faint clatter of a wagon on a cobblestone street, the distant bark of a dog, the soft chuckle of water against the wooden pier. Your own body feels heavier now, more grounded, as if some part of you has absorbed the density of the shells and the slow rhythm of their filtering. You breathe out, a long, gentle exhalation, and the breath mingles with the river's mist that is still rising in scattered patches, the last traces of the dawn dissolving into the full light of morning. The mussels remain where they have always been, layered in nacre, bedded in silt, breathing the river in their quiet, constant way, and you carry a small piece of that calm with you as you turn from the bank and begin the slow walk toward the factory. The shell wagon arrives not with a clatter or a shout, but with a gradual announcement of creaking wood and the slow, rhythmic clop of iron-shod hooves on packed cobblestones, sounds that carry through the morning air of Muscatine with a drowsy familiarity. You are standing near the side entrance of the brick factory building on 2nd Street, a 3-story structure of dark red brick whose tall windows catch the climbing sun and hold it in panes of milky reflection. And you have been waiting for this wagon without impatience, simply breathing the cool air and watching the street slowly come into its daytime shape. The wagon is a heavy, flat-bedded vehicle painted a faded green, its wooden sides scarred by years of use, its iron axles making a low, rhythmic groan as they revolve, and it is pulled by a single draft horse of substantial bone and calm disposition, a bay with a white blaze on its forehead that moves with the steady, plodding gait of an animal that has made this journey many times before. The driver sits on a simple bench at the front, the reins held loosely in one gloved hand, his body rocking gently with the motion of the wagon, and he wears a broad-brimmed hat and a canvas coat, identical in its faded, practical brown to the one worn by the shell gatherer on the river, as if the work of the river and the work of the factory are linked by a common uniform of quiet labor. As the wagon draws closer, you can see the load that fills its bed, a large mound of raw mussel shells heaped high and covered with a heavy canvas tarpaulin that is tied down at the corners with lengths of frayed rope. The canvas is dark with moisture in places, the dampness seeping through from the shells beneath, and you catch the smell of the load before you fully see it, a mineral, earthy scent of river mud and old water, and the faint cool odor of living things that have been pulled from their element. A smell that is not unpleasant, but rather deeply natural, like the smell of a garden after a long rain. The driver pulls gently on the reins as he approaches the factory, and the horse slows its pace without any verbal command, turning slightly toward the building as if it knows the exact spot where it should stop. And indeed it does, for the cobblestones here are worn into faint grooves from the daily repetition of this very maneuver. With a soft exhalation that sends a small puff of white breath into the air, the horse comes to a halt beside a wide wooden door that leads into the shell storage area, and the wagon settles on its springs with a gentle creak that seems to signal the end of one phase of the morning and the beginning of another. The driver sets the brake with a simple, practiced motion of a lever, wraps the reins loosely around a post on the wagon's side, and climbs down from his seat with the careful deliberation of a man who has spent decades working with his body and knows the value of economy of motion. His boots, sturdy and scuffed, hit the cobblestones with a soft thud, and he stretches his back by placing his hands on his hips and leaning slightly backward, a motion that is over in a few seconds and leaves him standing perfectly still, looking at the mound of shells as if assessing its size and weight with the casual precision of long experience. He then reaches up to the corner of the canvas cover and begins to untie the ropes, his fingers working the knots with a patience that seems to exist outside of time, pulling the coarse fibers slowly apart until the rope goes slack and he can fold back the first edge of the tarpaulin. The canvas is stiff in places where it has dried in the sun, and it crackles faintly as he folds it over the side of the wagon, revealing the shells beneath in a cascade of shifting light and shadow that catches the varied surfaces of the shells, some dark and wet, some drying to a pale gray, all of them bearing the marks of their river life in the ridges and stains and occasional flecks of green algae that still cling to the exterior. The sight of the shells in their piled abundance is both monotonous and strangely beautiful. They are heaped together without order, lying at every possible angle, their shapes roughly oval, and their colors ranging from deep olive brown to a lighter tan that shows where the sun has bleached the outer layer of organic material. A few of them are still closed tightly, the two valves pressed together by the now dry ligament that once held them fast, preserving the last moisture of the river inside their sealed interiors. Many more are slightly open, their edges separated by just a crack, revealing a thin, dark line of emptiness where the soft body has been removed by the shell gatherers before the journey began or has dried and disintegrated during the slow ride into town. You can see the interior nacre of a few shells that have broken during transport, the rainbow luster catching the morning light in flashes of pale pink and watery green, each glimpse a small, quiet treasure that vanishes as the pile shifts when the driver folds back the next section of the canvas. The driver works his way around the wagon, untying each rope in turn, and the entire process takes several minutes, during which time nothing else happens. No one appears at the factory door, no other wagons pass on the street. There is only the soft sound of the rope slipping through the grommets and the occasional stamp of the horse's hoof on the cobblestones as it shifts its weight from one leg to another. With the canvas fully removed and folded neatly into a thick square that he places on the driver's seat, the driver walks to the back of the wagon and reaches for a wide wooden shovel that is stored in brackets along the side. The shovel is old, its blade worn thin at the edge and polished to a smooth sheen by the friction of countless shells sliding over its surface, and the handle is dark with the accumulated oils of many hands. The driver does not hurry as he positions a large wooden barrow, a two-wheeled cart with high sides, directly beneath the tailgate of the wagon, and then he lowers the tailgate itself, which descends with a low groan, and a soft bang as it settles into its horizontal position. The shells nearest the edge slide forward an inch or two, a small cascade of movement that sounds like dry bones settling in an old tomb, and then everything is still again, waiting for the first shovelful. The driver lifts the shovel and sinks it into the edge of the mound with a motion that is neither forceful nor hesitant, a smooth insertion that produces a gritty, scraping sound as the blade slides between the shells, and then he lifts, his arms moving with the steady rhythm of a pendulum, and carries the first load over to the barrow. The shells slide off the shovel and into the wooden cart with a clatter that is surprisingly soft, a muted tumbling that lacks any sharp edge, more like the sound of heavy leaves falling onto a pile of similar leaves than the clashing of hard objects. The driver returns to the wagon, sinks the shovel again, lifts, carries, and tips, and each repetition is almost identical to the one before, a continuous loop of motion that the eye begins to follow with the same hypnotic ease that accompanies the watching of waves lapping against a shore. You notice, after perhaps a dozen cycles, that the mound in the wagon has diminished by a visible amount, its peak lowered, its edge receded from the tailgate, and that the barrow is filling steadily, the shells inside it lying in a jumbled pile that rises toward the wooden crossbar. The driver pauses after filling the barrow to a level that seems to satisfy some internal measure, and he rests the shovel against the side of the wagon with the blade pointing upward, its damp edge catching the light. He then grips the handles of the barrow and tilts it backward, balancing it on its wheels, and begins to walk slowly toward the wooden door of the factory, his pace slightly faster than before due to the weight he is now moving, but still entirely unhurried. The wheels of the barrow squeak faintly with each revolution, a high, thin note that repeats in a steady beat, and the shells inside the cart jostle against each other with a continuous low rustle, a sound you can hear even from where you stand across the street. The driver pauses at the door, shifts his grip to free one hand, and pushes it open with a firm shove, and then he and the barrow disappear inside the building, the squeaking wheels and rustling shells slowly fading as he moves deeper into the factory. The street becomes quiet again. The horse stands motionless, its tail switching once, twice in a slow, lazy arc that flicks away a single fly. The sun, now fully risen, has begun to warm the cobblestones and the bricks, and you can feel the faint heat radiating from the wall behind you. A small, pleasant sensation that adds to the overall sense of calm. Inside the factory, beyond the doorway where you cannot see, the driver tips the barrow forward, and the shells slide out in a rush that you hear as a muffled cascade, their descent ending in a splash that tells you they have landed in water. This is the large soaking tank, a rectangular wooden vat lined with sheet tin to keep it watertight, filled with fresh, cool water drawn from the city cistern, and it is here that the shells will rest for a day or longer, softening the dried mud and any remaining river grit that clings to their exterior, and loosening the dried remnants of the mussel bodies inside. The water in the tank is changed regularly, and at this hour of the morning it is clear enough that you could see the bottom if you were standing beside it, though by the end of the day it will have clouded with the sediment that dissolves off the hundreds of pounds of shells that will pass through it. The driver emerges from the door with the empty barrow, the wheels squeaking again in reverse, and he guides it back to its position at the back of the wagon, tilting it upright with a practiced tilt of his wrists. The cycle resumes, shovel and barrow and walk and tip, each iteration so similar that they blend together in your perception, the individual loads becoming indistinguishable from one another, just a gradual, steady reduction of the pile in the wagon, and a corresponding filling of the soaking tank inside. You watch the driver's face from time to time, noticing the way his brow begins to glisten with a thin film of perspiration as the morning warms, and you see him pause once to remove his hat, wipe his forehead with a handkerchief pulled from his back pocket, and then replace the hat with a single smooth motion that seems almost ceremonial in its simplicity. The horse, too, exhibits small signs of life during these minutes, lowering its head to sniff at a tuft of grass that grows between the cobblestones, lifting one hind hoof slightly off the ground in a resting posture, exhaling a long, slow breath that makes its nostrils flutter. The sounds of the street remain gentle, the distant crow of a rooster from somewhere up on the hill, the brief barking of a dog that stops almost as soon as it begins, the faint ringing of a church bell that marks the hour, with a series of slow, resonant tones that drift across the rooftops and fade into the river's constant murmur. As the wagon empties, the character of the shells that remain changes slightly. The bottom layers, which have been pressed down by the weight above them, are more broken than the ones near the top, and the driver's shovel now brings up fragments of nacre that flash in the sun with a brilliance that is startling even in its smallness, thin slivers of mother-of-pearl that seem to glow with an inner light before tumbling down into the wooden depth of the barrow. There are also small amounts of river gravel mixed into this bottom layer, rounded pebbles of limestone and quartz that were scooped up along with the shells from the riverbed, and the driver, with a patient sorting that adds no extra time to his work, occasionally picks out a larger stone and tosses it to the side of the street, where it lands with a soft clink on the cobblestones and sits there, a small reminder of the river far below the town. The mound continues to shrink, sinking toward the bed of the wagon, like a dune being worn away by a slow, steady wind, and the exposed wood of the wagon bed is dark with dampness, its grain raised where the water from the shells has soaked into it over many years. Eventually, the pile is gone. The driver uses a small hand broom to sweep the remaining fragments and dust into a pile at the back of the wagon, and he shovels these last bits into the barrow with a few quick, efficient motions, the broom making a soft whispering sound against the wood. He then takes the barrow for the final time, its load much lighter now, and disappears through the door. And when he returns, the barrow is empty, and he sets it upright beside the wagon, wiping his hands on the sides of his coat. The tailgate is lifted back into place, the canvas cover is shaken out and refolded, but it is not retied, for the wagon will remain here until the end of the day, when the driver will return to take it back to the riverbank for another load. The horse, sensing perhaps that the work is done, lifts its head and shakes its mane, and the driver goes to it, rubbing its nose with a gentle, absent affection before checking the harness and the traces, ensuring that nothing has loosened during the unloading. You remain where you are, observing these final moments of the wagon's arrival as if they were the closing lines of a quiet piece of music. The soaking tank inside the factory now holds its new burden, the shells settling into the cool water with a series of small silent shiftings as trapped air bubbles escape from their interiors and rise to the surface, and the sediment carried from the river begins to dissolve into the water, turning it a faint, murky brown that will deepen over the coming hours. The driver has finished his inspection and now stands beside the horse, one hand resting lightly on its flank, both of them facing the river where the morning mist has finally burned away completely, leaving the far bank visible as a distinct line of trees and the water itself a bright, moving sheet of silver under the climbing sun. You take a breath, and the air tastes of brick dust and river mud and the faint, clean scent of water from the soaking tank, a blend that speaks of the connection between this street and the mussel beds you visited in the earlier part of the morning. The wagon, empty now and still, looks like a sleeping animal, its work done, its purpose temporarily suspended, and you find that your own body has taken on something of its stillness, a deep calm that settles into your joints and behind your eyes, a readiness, not for action, but for more quiet observation as the factory prepares to receive the shells in their next stage of transformation. You step through the wide wooden door of the factory and into a long, high-ceilinged room that stretches before you with the quiet grandeur of a library or a chapel, its far end softened by distance into a hazy rectangle of brick and window light. The first thing you notice after the coolness of the outdoor morning is the temperature, which is neither warm nor cold, but settled into a comfortable middle range. The air held steady by the thick brick walls that insulate the space from the extremes of the season, so that even on a warm spring day like this one, the interior remains slightly cool, as if the building itself has absorbed the patience of the river and keeps its own time. The second thing you notice is the light, which enters through a series of tall windows set high in the north-facing wall, each window divided into small rectangular panes by thin wooden muntins painted a faded cream, and each pane glowing with the soft, diffused illumination that comes from a sky fully brightened but without direct sun, the kind of light that seems to have no single source, that simply fills the room like water filling a basin. This north light is prized by craftsmen of all kinds for its evenness and its lack of harsh shadows, and here in the button factory it falls across the workbenches in a steady, gentle wash that makes every surface easy to see without glare or strain. The room is larger than you expected, perhaps 80 feet long and 40 feet wide, and its ceiling rises to a height of at least 14 feet, supported by wooden beams that have darkened with age to the color of strong tea, their grain still visible in faint, wavy lines that meander from one end of each beam to the other. The floor beneath your feet is made of wide pine planks laid down decades ago when the factory was first built, and they had been worn smooth by the daily passage of work boots until the softer parts of the grain have receded slightly, leaving the harder ridges standing in very subtle relief, a texture you can feel through the soles of your shoes as a faint, regular pattern of slight rises and dips. The planks creak here and there as you walk slowly forward, not loudly, but with a low, woody note that seems to belong to the building, a voice it uses only when someone moves across it. Scattered across the floor, catching the light in tiny glints, are fragments of shell too small to be swept up by the end-of-day broom, thin slivers of nacre that have been trodden into the wood over years of work, so that the floor itself has acquired a faint, scattered shimmer, like the night sky reduced to its palest stars and pressed flat into pine. Arranged in 2 long rows that run the length of the room are the workbenches, 12 on each side, each one separated from its neighbor by a gap of about 3 feet, enough space for a worker to pass without disturbing the person beside him. The benches are built of the same dark, aged wood as the beams, their tops worn to a velvety smoothness, their legs sturdy and slightly splayed for stability, and each bench is equipped with its own set of tools arranged in a precise order that has been refined by years of practice. At the front of each bench, closest to the center aisle, sits a small wooden bin about the size of a bushel basket, but rectangular in shape, and it is into this bin that the soaked and clean shells will be placed at the start of the day, their wet surfaces drying slowly in the still air. Beside the bin, bolted firmly to the bench top, is the cutting press itself, a foot-operated machine of cast iron and tempered steel whose design has not changed in any meaningful way since the first pearl button factory opened in Muscatine more than a decade ago. The press consists of a heavy base plate, a vertical shaft guided by a greased sleeve, and a lever mechanism that connects to a wide wooden pedal near the floor, the whole assembly painted a dark, practical black that has worn away in places to reveal the silver grey of the underlying metal. At the bottom of the shaft, where it meets the work surface, is the cutter, a hollow cylindrical saw with a sharp, toothed rim that descends when the pedal is pressed and retracts when the pressure is released. And it is this simple, durable tool that transforms a rough mussel shell into a smooth, round disc ready for drilling and finishing. To the right of the press, within easy reach of the worker's dominant hand, is a shallow wooden tray divided into compartments by thin slats, and it is here that the newly cut discs will be placed, each one nestled beside its fellows in a growing collection of pearlescent circles. To the left is a larger bin, open at the top, and lined with a coarse burlap sack, destined to receive the waste fragments of shell after the usable disc has been removed, the pieces that are too small or too oddly shaped to be turned into buttons. You can see that some of these waste bins already contain a few fragments left over from the previous day's cleaning, the curved pieces of nacre-lined shell, catching the light in muted flashes of pink and grey. Every bench is identical in its arrangement, and this uniformity has a calming effect on the eye. The repetition of the same simple layout drawing your gaze down the row and then back again, as if following the lines of a field of wheat or the rows of a quiet orchard. At this early hour, the factory floor is not yet full. A few workers have already arrived and are at their benches, but many more are still making their way through the streets of Muscatine, walking from the boarding houses and small family homes that cluster on the hills above the river, their footsteps unhurried, their lunch pails swinging gently at their sides. You watch as one of the early arrivals, a man of perhaps 40 years with a calm, weathered face and hair the color of dry sand, settles onto the stool at his bench, with the slow, habitual movements of someone who has performed this same sequence thousands of times before. He wears a simple shirt of cream-colored cotton, with the sleeves rolled to just below his elbows, and over it a canvas apron that covers him from chest to knee, its surface marked with the pale dust of ground shell and the darker stains of machine oil. His hands, when he rests them on the bench top for a moment before beginning, are strong and square, the nails trimmed short, the skin on the palms thickened in the places where the shells press against them hour after hour. He does not look around the room or acknowledge the other workers in any obvious way. There is no need for greeting or conversation, for the rhythm of the factory is a quiet, individual rhythm, each worker entering his own private focus as naturally as a sleeper entering a dream. You find a place to stand near the wall, out of the way of the aisle, where you can observe without being observed, and you let your attention drift across the details of the room as the sunlight slowly shifts its angle through the high windows. The walls are unadorned, their brick surfaces painted a pale cream that has yellowed slightly with time, and here and there you see a dark rectangle where a sign or a notice was once hung and has since been removed. In one corner, near the far end of the room, stands a large cast-iron stove, unlit now in the mild weather, its flue pipe rising straight up through the ceiling, and beside it is a wooden crate filled with split logs that will feed the fire when the cold months return. Near the stove, a tall wooden cabinet with glass-fronted doors holds spare parts for the cutting press's extra springs, replacement cutters of various diameters, small tins of grease, a collection of wrenches and pliers hanging from hooks on the inside of the doors. The cabinet is neatly organized, each item in its designated place, and the orderliness of it adds to the sense of calm that pervades the room, a sense that everything here has a purpose and a location, that no energy is wasted on confusion or disorder. The man with the sand-colored hair has begun his work now, and you watch as he reaches into the bin of shells at his left and selects one, turning it over briefly in his fingers to assess its shape and size, the weight of it, the place where the cutter should be positioned to extract the largest possible disc. His touch is gentle but firm, the shell resting in his palm as if it were a small bird he has just picked up from the ground, and after a moment of consideration he places it flat on the base plate of the press, his thumb holding it steady against the metal surface. His right foot, clad in a simple leather shoe with a worn heel, comes to rest on the wooden pedal, and he presses down with a smooth, even pressure, the shaft descending, the cutter meeting the shell with a soft grinding sound that is half crunch and half whisper, the sound of hard steel parting something less hard, a material that gives way layer by layer as the teeth bite through the nacre and the outer shell. The pedal reaches the bottom of its travel, the cutter completes its circle, and then the foot lifts, the spring inside the mechanism pulls the shaft back up, and there, resting on the base plate, is a perfect round disc of pearlescent material, still slightly warm from the friction of the cut. The worker picks it up, blows a tiny puff of dust from its surface and places it in the wooden tray to his right, and then he drops the remaining shell fragment, now a rough ring with a hole in its center, into the waste bin on his left. The entire sequence has taken perhaps 10 seconds, and already his hand is reaching for the next shell. The other workers who have arrived are performing the same sequence at their own benches, each at their own pace, and the sounds of the room begin to layer into a gentle, continuous murmur that is not quite music, but has a music-like quality. A soft percussion of cutters meeting shells, the occasional squeak of a pedal hinge, the faint rustle of discs dropping into wooden trays, the deeper clatter of waste fragments tumbling into burlap-lined bins. No one speaks loudly. No one speaks at all, for the most part, though occasionally 2 workers at adjacent benches might exchange a few low words about the quality of the shells that day or the sharpness of a particular cutter, their voices barely rising above the background hum. The overall effect is of a room full of focused, contented activity, a kind of collective meditation in which each person's attention is fully absorbed by the simple, repetitive task before them, and the hours ahead stretch out not as a burden to be endured, but as a calm, predictable span of time to be filled with small, useful motions. You let your gaze travel along the row of benches, noticing the subtle differences between the workers despite the uniformity of their equipment. One man, younger than the others and perhaps new to the factory, works with slightly more visible concentration, his brow faintly furrowed, his movements a fraction slower as he takes care to position each shell precisely. Another, older and clearly a veteran of many years of the press, cuts his discs with a rhythm so steady it could be timed by a metronome, his foot and hands moving in a seamless flow that seems to require no conscious thought at all. A third worker pauses between shells to take a sip of water from a tin cup he keeps on the windowsill behind him, the water catching the light as he lifts it, and you can see the way his throat moves as he swallows, the brief moment of refreshment before he returns to the work, his rhythm unbroken by the interruption. Each of them wears the same canvas apron, the same simple, practical clothing, and each of them carries the same fine dust of ground shell on their forearms and the fronts of their shirts, a pale, powdery coating that makes them look, in the diffuse north light, like figures in a painting by an old master, their edges softened, their colors muted to earth tones and creams. The air in the room has its own particular smell, a combination of the clean, mineral scent of the shells, the faint oiliness of the machinery, and the dry, woody odor of the aged timber that surrounds you on all sides. It is not a strong smell, not something that would strike a visitor as unpleasant, but rather a subtle, layered fragrance that seems to belong to the factory as much as its bricks and its windows. a smell that has been building for years and will continue to build for years more, soaking into the wood and the fabric and even into the clothing of the workers, so that they carry it home with them at the end of the day, a faint reminder of where they have been. You breathe this air slowly, letting it fill your lungs, and you find that it has a calming effect, this blend of the natural and the mechanical, the ancient shells and the modern cast iron, all mingled together in a single coherent atmosphere. The sunlight continues its slow shift across the room, and you notice now that a shaft of brighter light has found its way through one of the higher panes of the windows, falling diagonally across the central aisle and illuminating a patch of the wooden floor with a warm, golden glow. In this shaft of light, tiny particles of shell dust drift and swirl with the slow, random motion of a snow globe just after it has been shaken, each speck catching the light for a moment before moving on. The whole effect a delicate, silent dance that you could watch for a long time without tiring of it. The dust settles imperceptibly, sometimes landing on the sleeve of a worker who happens to pass through the beam, sometimes drifting down to join the general, even coating that covers every surface, and the light itself remains steady, a solid column of brightness in the otherwise diffuse illumination of the room, a reminder that outside these walls the sun is climbing toward its noon position, that the day is moving forward in its own quiet way. You become aware after some time that your own breathing has synchronized with the rhythm of the factory, the gentle pulse of inhale and exhale matching the rise and fall of the foot pedals, the beat of the waste fragments dropping into the bins. There is no clock visible in the room, no timepiece to measure the minutes, and yet the minutes pass all the same, marked only by the diminishing pile of shells in the bin of the sand-haired worker, the growing collection of discs in his tray. The morning has opened itself fully now. The last of the workers have arrived and taken their places at their benches, and all 24 cutting presses are in operation, their combined sound filling the room with a steady, soothing hum that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. You stay where you are, leaning against the cool brick wall, and you let your eyes fall half closed, not sleeping but resting in that pleasant state between full awareness and dreaming, where the world becomes a wash of soft sounds and gentle light, and the slow, endless repetition of quiet work. The sand-haired worker has settled into his rhythm now, the steady, unhurried pulse of motion that seems to flow through his hands and his foot and the iron press as if they were all parts of a single, quiet machine. You watch him from your place by the wall, and you begin to see the cutting of the discs, not as a series of separate actions, but as one continuous flowing movement, like the turning of a wheel or the lapping of water against a pier. A repetition so smooth that the individual cycles blur into a single sustained note. His left hand moves to the bin of soaked shells, the fingers spreading slightly as they descend, and they close around a single shell with a gentle, practiced grip, the thumb resting on the curved back, the forefinger finding the edge where the two valves meet. He lifts the shell from the bin without looking at it directly, his gaze remaining somewhere in the middle distance, focused on nothing in particular, and the shell comes up dripping a few drops of water that fall back into the bin with soft, separate plinks that are barely audible over the hum of the other presses. The shell turns over in his hand as he brings it toward the press, a slow rotation that allows him to assess its shape by touch alone, the pants of his fingers reading the contours, the thickness of the edge, the slight irregularity where a ridge of growth has created a bump on the outer surface. This rotation takes only a second or two, and during it his expression remains perfectly neutral, his eyes half-lidded in the calm focus of long practice, and you can see that the assessment is not a conscious decision but an embodied knowledge, a skill that has been repeated so many times that it now lives in the hands rather than the brain. He places the shell flat on the base plate of the press with the inner surface facing upward, the faint shimmer of the nacre catching the north light in a soft, milky gleam, and his thumb holds it steady against the cool metal, pressing with just enough force to keep it from shifting, but not so much that the shell might crack before the cutter even descends. His right foot, which has been resting lightly on the wooden pedal, now presses down with a smooth, even motion, the ankle flexing, the calf muscle tightening slightly beneath the fabric of his trouser leg, and the pedal descends through its short arc with a faint creak from the hinge that connects it to the floor bracket. Above, in the body of the press, the shaft slides downward through its greased sleeve. the mechanism translating the foot's pressure into a steady, vertical force, and the hollow cylindrical cutter, its toothed rim glinting faintly with the residue of cutting oil, comes down toward the waiting shell. The moment the cutter touches the inner surface of the nacre, there is a brief, soft resistance, a sensation the worker can feel through the pedal as a slight increase in the required pressure, and then the teeth bite through the first layer, and the sound begins. The sound of the cut is a low, grinding note that is neither harsh nor pleasant, but something in between, a noise that the ear quickly accepts as part of the background texture of the room, like the hum of bees in a garden or the distant rumble of a wagon on cobblestones. It starts with a slight crunch as the teeth break through the smooth inner surface, and then it deepens into a steady, gritty rasp as the cutter works its way through the thicker layers of the shell, the calcium carbonate yielding to the harder steel in a fine spray of pale dust that puffs out from beneath the cutter's rim and settles on the base plate in a thin, even ring. The worker's foot continues its downward travel, steady and unhurried, and the cutter completes its circle through the full thickness of the shell, the resistance dropping away suddenly as the teeth emerge on the other side and meet only air, the sound changing from a rasp to a soft, clean whir as the cutter spins free for a fraction of a second before the foot reaches the bottom of its stroke. The pedal touches its lowest point with a gentle bump that the worker feels through the sole of his shoe, and then his foot relaxes, the pressure releasing, the spring inside the press pulling the shaft back upward with a smooth, oiled hiss that is the quietest part of the entire sequence. The cutter rises, revealing the result of its work, a perfect circle of shell material, a disc about the diameter of a nickel or a quarter, depending on the size of the original shell, resting on the base plate beside the now hollowed remainder of the mussel valve. The disc is pale, the color of fresh cream or the inner petals of a white rose, and its surface is slightly rough from the cut, the concentric lines of the nacre layers visible as faint, ghostly rings that catch the light at slightly different angles, creating a subtle, watery shimmer that moves as the disc is lifted. The worker picks up the disc between his thumb and index finger, his touch delicate enough that he does not smudge the surface with the fine shell dust that coats his fingertips, and he holds it up for just a moment, not to admire it, but to check that the cut is clean and the edges are smooth. A quality inspection that takes less than a second and is performed with the same automatic care as every other step. Satisfied, he lowers the disc to his right and places it in the shallow wooden tray, nestling it beside the others that have accumulated over the past half hour, the tray now holding perhaps 20 or 30 discs, arranged in a loose, irregular pattern that shifts slightly as each new disc is added. The discs click softly against one another as they settle, a delicate sound like the tapping of fingernails on fine china, and the pile they form is a study in subtle variation, no two discs exactly the same shade, some leaning toward a faint pink, others toward a cooler silver blue, all of them sharing the same quiet pearlescent glow that seems to come from somewhere beneath their surfaces. The worker's left hand, meanwhile, has already moved to the waste bin, carrying the shell fragment, the ring of material that remains after the disc has been removed, its shape roughly oval with a neat circular hole in the center, like a strange primitive coin, and the fragment drops into the burlap-lined bin with a soft clatter, joining the growing collection of similar fragments that will later be gathered up and taken out to the waste pile by the river, completing the cycle that began when the shell was first lifted from its bin moments before. The worker's hand returns to the shell bin, and the sequence begins again, as nearly identical to the first as the first was to the one before it. The same reach, the same lift, the same rotation and placement and press and release and sorting, a loop that repeats every 10 or 12 seconds, 6 times a minute, more than 300 times an hour, until the individual repetitions become indistinguishable from one another, blending into a continuous stream of quiet productivity that fills the morning with its gentle mental pulse. You watch not the details of each cut now, but the overall shape of the work, the way the worker's shoulders move with a slight rolling motion that accommodates the reach to the left and the placement to the right, the way his foot rocks on the pedal in a steady, wave-like rhythm, the way his head nods almost imperceptibly with the completion of each cycle, a tiny acknowledgement of a task completed, already fading into the next. The shell bin on his left, which was nearly full when you first began watching, has now diminished by a visible amount, its contents settling lower, the shells at the bottom lying in a shallow pool of water that has drained from the ones above, the water cloudy with dissolved river silt and tiny fragments of broken shell edges. The worker, without breaking his rhythm, reaches down and stirs the remaining shells with a cupped hand, a quick, gentle motion that redistributes them and brings a few of the deeper shells to the surface, ensuring that he does not have to stretch too far down into the bin as the level drops. This small adjustment, this moment of practical care, is performed with the same unhurried grace as every other motion, and it reminds you that the work is not mindless, but rather so deeply learned that it has become a form of meditation, a quiet focus that occupies the hands and leaves the mind free to drift in peaceful, undirected thought. The sound of the cutting presses, now that you have been listening to them for some time, has resolved itself into a complex, layered texture that your ears have learned to inhabit rather than simply hear. There is the deep, steady bass note of the heavier presses cutting the larger shells, a low grinding that you can feel as much as hear, a vibration that travels through the floorboards and up into the soles of your shoes. Above this, there is the lighter, higher sound of the smaller cutters, a quicker, sharper rasp that cuts through the background hum, like a flute through the murmur of cellos. The foot pedals contribute their own percussive element, a soft, rhythmic creaking that varies slightly from bench to bench depending on the condition of the hinges, and beneath it all, like a river beneath a bridge, runs the constant gentle rustle of discs being placed in trays and fragments dropping into waste bins, a dry, papery sound that never quite stops, that has no beginning and no end, that simply continues. The air in the room has thickened slightly with the dust of the cutting, a fine pale powder that hangs in the shafts of sunlight and settles on every flat surface, giving the benches a soft, velvety coating that the workers wipe away from their presses occasionally with a sweep of the hand. The dust has a faint mineral smell, like chalk or dried river clay, and it mingles with the oil from the machines to create an atmosphere that is unique to this room and this work, a blend of the organic and the mechanical that you find yourself breathing without concern, for it is only ground shell after all, the same material that lines the inside of a mussel's home, now floating free in the air of a human workshop. The workers, you notice, do not cough or sneeze. Their lungs have long since adjusted to the dust, and it bothers them no more than the pollen of a summer field bothers a farmer. You shift your attention now from the sand-haired worker to the others along the row, and you see that each one has developed his own slight variation on the same basic rhythm, a personal signature written in the tempo of the foot and the angle of the hand. The young worker still cuts with a measured, careful pace, his discs accumulating more slowly, but with a precision that is evident in the neatness of his tray, each disc placed exactly parallel to the next, the pile forming a tidy, geometric pattern. The older worker at the far end of the row, by contrast, works with a speed that seems almost careless, but is in fact the efficiency of a master, his hand moving so quickly from bin to press to tray that the individual motions blur into a fluid, continuous dance, and his tray is already half full while others are only a quarter filled. Between these extremes, the rest of the workers occupy a spectrum of pace and style, each one finding his own comfortable speed, his own natural rhythm, and the factory does not demand uniformity of tempo, only the steady, sustained effort that fills the hours with useful work. A worker near the middle of the row pauses his cutting to attend to his press, lifting a small oil can from the shelf beneath his bench and applying a few drops of oil to the shaft sleeve, the oil gleaming amber in the light as it runs down the dark metal, and then he works the pedal a few times to distribute the lubrication, the press moving with a renewed smoothness and quietness that he acknowledges with a small satisfied nod before returning to his shells. Another worker rises from his stool and walks slowly to the cabinet at the far end of the room, his footsteps creaking on the floorboards, and he selects a replacement cutter from the rack inside the glass-fronted doors, the new cutter shining with the bright, unmarked steel of a freshly sharpened tool, and he carries it back to his bench and sets about the patient work of removing the old cutter and bolting the new one in place, his fingers working the wrench with the same calm deliberation that characterizes all the motions in this room. These small interruptions, far from breaking the rhythm of the factory, seem to be part of it, like the rests in a piece of music that gives shape to the notes, and the overall hum of work continues around them without pause or urgency. The morning has moved on while you have been watching. the sun climbing higher beyond the north-facing windows, and the light in the room has shifted from the soft, diffuse glow of early morning to a brighter, more direct illumination that picks out the details of the benches with greater clarity. The dust motes dance more thickly in the shafts of sunlight now, and the shadows under the benches have sharpened slightly, the contrast between light and dark becoming more pronounced as the day advances toward noon. The temperature has risen by a few degrees, not uncomfortably, just enough that you notice a slight warmth on your face when you turn toward the windows and you see that one of the workers has opened a small vent near the ceiling, a wooden flap that tilts outward to admit a thin stream of fresh air that moves through the room with a cool, river-scented breath, stirring the dust and the smells into a gentle circulation before it finds its way out through the cracks around the far door. You let your eyes close for a moment, not from tiredness but from a desire to experience the factory through your other senses, and you find that the sound of the cutting presses is even more intricate when you are not watching the movements that produce it. It becomes a kind of music, a steady, droning chord that seems to vibrate in the air and in the floor, in your chest, and in the thin bones behind your ears, a sound that has no melody but a profound, enveloping harmony, the harmony of many hands doing the same quiet work, in the same quiet work, in the harmony that has been sounding in this building for years and will sound for years, more long after this particular morning has faded into memory. The grinding of the cutters, the creak of the pedals, the rustle of discs and fragments, the distant murmur of the river that you can still hear faintly through the open vent, all blend together into a single, sustained note that seems to hold you suspended, weightless, in the warm, dusty air of the factory, and you breathe in time with it, slowly, deeply, letting the rhythm carry you along like a leaf on the surface of a wide, calm stream. When you open your eyes again, the sand-haired worker has reached the bottom of his shell bin, the last few shells lying in the shallow, cloudy water, and he scoops them up together in one hand and places them on the bench beside the press, where they will wait for the final cuts of this batch. His tray of discs is nearly full, the pale circles glowing with their gentle inner light, and his waste bin is heaped with the hollowed rings of discarded shell, their nacre interiors catching the light in random flashes of pink and green. He pauses for just a moment, rolling his shoulders in a slow, circular motion that eases the muscles of his upper back, and then he picks up the first of the remaining shells, turns it over in his fingers, and places it on the base plate, his foot already beginning its downward press, the cutter descending, the cycle continuing without break or hurry, as steady and patient as the river that gave these shells their shape. The tray of cut discs, now nearly full and shimmering with the soft, watery luster of fresh nacre, is lifted from the bench by the sand-haired worker with both hands, cradled carefully like a pan of milk carried from a barn, and carried down the center aisle toward the second work area, at the far end of the long room. You follow this movement with your gaze, turning your head slowly, and you see that the far end of the factory, which you had only glimpsed before through the haze of dust and distance, is arranged differently from the cutting floor, with smaller benches set against the south wall, each one equipped not with a heavy foot press, but with a slender, upright drill and a wooden sorting tray, the tools of the next stage in the button-making process. The sand-haired worker sets the tray of discs down on a narrow table that serves as a transfer point between the cutting and drilling sections, and he pauses there for a moment, his hands resting flat on the table edge, his gaze traveling across the room toward the windows. A brief, unfocused rest before he returns to his bench to begin a new batch. Another worker, a woman with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a simple white cap and wearing a clean apron over her dress, rises from her stool at one of the drilling benches and walks over to collect the tray, her movements quiet and efficient, her shoes making a soft, brushing sound on the worn pine floor. She carries the tray to her bench with the same careful, balanced gait that the sand-haired worker used, and she sets it down on the left side of her work surface, positioning it so that the discs are within easy reach, their pale circles arranged in the haphazard, overlapping pattern left by the cutter. Her bench is smaller and lighter than the cutting benches, a delicate cousin to those heavy, iron-fitted workstations, and its surface is kept meticulously clean, white-free of dust and oil, because the discs at this stage are finished on their faces, and any grit could scratch the soft nacre. At the center of the bench stands the drill press, a compact machine of polished steel and brass, its vertical spindle as thin as a knitting needle, its chuck holding a tiny needle-sharp bit that gleams under the north light with the cold, precise shine of a surgical instrument. The drill is operated not by a foot pedal but by a small hand lever at the side, a slender rod of turned wood that fits into the palm, and it requires only a gentle, controlled pressure to lower the spinning bit through the face of a disc, piercing one or two pairs of holes with a clean, silent neatness. Beside the drill, on the right side of the bench, is the sorting tray, a flat wooden board about the size of an open book. Its surface drilled with a series of circular depressions in graduated sizes, each one labeled with a tiny hand-painted number that has faded over the years to a soft, brownish tint. The depressions are arranged in neat rows, the smallest at the top, no wider than a pencil eraser, the largest at the bottom, broad enough to span the width of 2 fingers, and each depression has been worn smooth by the passage of thousands of discs pressed into it during the daily work of sorting. A shallow bin to the right of the sorting tray waits to receive the finished, sorted discs, and another, smaller bin to the left collects the rare rejects, discs that have cracked during drilling or that reveal some hidden flaw in the nacre that was not visible before the cut. The woman settles onto a stool, a simple 3-legged seat of turned maple that has conformed over years of use to the shape of many sitters, and she adjusts her apron, smoothing it over her knees with a habitual, unhurried motion. She reaches for the first disc in the tray, lifting it between her thumb and forefinger with a touch that is even lighter than the cutter's touch. For these discs are thin and fragile, no thicker than a heavy piece of paper, and they can snap under too much pressure, ruining the work of the previous stage in an instant. She holds the disc up briefly, not to admire its luster, but to check the orientation, noting which side is the outer face and which is the inner. A distinction that matters for the drilling because the holes must be countersunk from the front, so that the thread will lie flush when the button is sewn onto fabric. The outer face is slightly more lustrous, the nacre layers more tightly packed, and the inner face shows fine concentric lines that reveal the underlying structure, and the woman reads these signs with the quick, practiced eye of someone who has handled more discs than she could ever count. She places the disc on the small felt-lined platform beneath the drill bit, positioning it with a precise, gentle push of her fingertip until the spot where the holes will go is directly under the needle point. And then her right hand moves to the wooden lever, her palm wrapping around it with a light, relaxed grip. The lever is pulled down with a smooth, steady motion, the drill bit descending in a tight, spinning blur driven by a small belt that runs up to an overhead shaft, the same kind of belt-driven system that powers the cutting presses, its motion transmitted through a series of pulleys and leather straps that hum softly along the ceiling. The bit touches the surface of the disc with a sound that is nothing like the grinding of the cutter, a high, thin whine that lasts only a fraction of a second. The sound of hard steel parting soft nacre with almost no resistance, and then the lever is released, the spindle rises, and a tiny, perfect hole remains in the disc, its edges clean and unchipped, a small dark circle in the pale surface that will soon be joined by a second hole beside it. The disc is shifted a precise distance, the woman's left hand moving it with a deft, practiced nudge that places the next hole location under the bit, and the lever is pulled again. The whine sounds again, and the second hole appears, completing the pair. For some larger discs, the process is repeated for a second pair of holes, creating the 4-hole pattern used for coats and jackets, and the woman's rhythm adjusts seamlessly to the different spacing required, her hands knowing the positions without any need for measurement or marking, the locations held in her muscle memory with the precision of a jeweler. The drilled disc is then lifted from the platform and held up one more time, given a quick visual check to ensure that the holes are clean and properly aligned, and then it is lowered to the sorting tray, where it is placed into the first depression, tested for fit. The sorting is a quiet, methodical process that follows each drilling, the disc being pressed gently into the circular depression that corresponds to its diameter, and if it fits exactly, nestling into the depression with a soft, satisfying click of wood against nacre, it is lifted out and dropped into the finished bin, its size confirmed. If it is too large for the depression chosen, the woman moves it to the next size up. If it is too small, she moves it down a size, and this trial takes only a second or two, the disc moving from depression to depression with the smooth, darting motion of a hummingbird testing flowers, until it finds its proper home and is deposited into the bin with its same-sized fellows. until it finds its proper home and is deposited into the bin with its same-sized fellows. The sorting tray ensures that every disc is categorized correctly. The size is standardized so that the finished buttons will be uniform when they are sewn onto garments, and the woman performs this quality control with a steady, rhythmic attention that never wavers, her eyes moving from disc to depression to bin in a slow, continuous loop that matches the loop of the cutting presses across the room. The finished bin fills gradually with salted discs, the pale circles now lying in neat layers, each layer representing a single size. The sizes kept separate by thin wooden dividers that slot into the bin, and the overall effect is of a collection of small pearlescent moons, each one marked with the tiny, precise perforations that will allow it to be sewn onto fabric and fastened with thread. The woman pauses occasionally to empty a full bin into a larger storage container on the floor beside her bench, a lidded wooden box with a hinged top, and she does this with the same careful, unhurried motion that characterizes all her work, lifting the bin, tilting it gently and letting the discs slide out in a soft, rustling cascade that sounds like dry leaves falling onto a still pond. The belt-driven system that powers the drills hums overhead with a steady, even note, a continuous presence that you can feel as a faint vibration in the air, and the wooden pulleys turn in their brackets with a soft, rhythmic ticking as the leather belts pass over the joins. A sound that is almost like a clock, marking the passage of time in tiny, regular increments. The other workers at the drilling benches, 5 of them in total, each one a woman in a clean apron and a simple cap, perform the same sequence of lift, position, drill, shift, drill, test, sort, deposit, a cycle that merges with its neighbors into a gentle, collective flow. The whine of the drills rising and falling in asynchronous waves that overlap and separate and overlap again, creating a texture of sound that is lighter and higher than the cutting floor, more delicate, more precise, but equally calming in its steady fragilities. You notice now, as you watch the dark-haired woman work, that the drilling requires a different kind of patience than the cutting. The cutting is a physical act, the foot pressing down against resistance, the body engaged in a small but tangible effort, while the drilling is almost entirely a matter of finesse. The hand pulling the lever with a touch so light that it seems the disc could be pierced by thought alone. The woman's face reflects this difference, her expression serene and slightly withdrawn, her eyes focused on the tiny point where the bit meets the nacre, her lips slightly parted in the way of someone who is thinking of something else entirely, a memory perhaps, or a song half remembered, her conscious mind drifting freely while her hands perform their well-learned task. This is the luxury of mastered skill, the ability to be present and absent at the same time, to let the body do what it knows how to do while the mind wanders through quiet, private landscapes, and you feel a sense of kinship with this state, for your own mind has been drifting similarly as you watch, your thoughts loosening and floating away like the dust motes in the sunbeams. The light through the windows has begun to shift again, the sun moving past its zenith and beginning its slow afternoon descent toward the western hills, and the quality of the illumination changes with it, the bright, direct light of midday softening into a warmer, more golden tone that makes the nacre of the discs glow with a deeper, richer luster. The pinks becoming more pronounced, the greens taking on an aqua tint, the blues deepening to the color of a winter sky reflected in still water. The woman at the drilling bench notices this change in her own way, tilting a newly drilled disc slightly to catch the warmer light, observing the way the colors shift across the surface, and then she places it in the sorting tray with no change in her rhythm, a tiny moment of appreciation that passes as quickly as it came and leaves no trace behind. The discs themselves, now that you have seen so many of them pass through her hands, have begun to reveal their individuality, each one unique in its exact shade and its pattern of nacre lines, some perfectly smooth, others marked with faint, ghostly ripples that indicate a moment of rapid growth in the mussel's long life, still others showing a tiny crescent-shaped mark where a grain of sand was once instead, and coated with layer upon layer of pearly secretion. A floor that would care is simply a surface, a tiny map of the shale tis. A faint, sweet smell drifts into the room from somewhere outside, perhaps the honeysuckle that grows along the fence behind the factory, and it mingles with the mineral dust and the machine oil in a way that is not unpleasant, a reminder that the world outside continues in its own quiet rhythm. The flowers opening and closing, the river flowing, the clouds moving slowly across the sky in shapes that reform and dissolve without witness. The drilling continues. The whine of the bits, the click of the levers, the soft rustle of the discs being sorted, all blend together into a seamless, hypnotic fabric of sound that wraps around you as comfortably as a well-worn blanket on a cool evening, and you find that your breathing has become so slow and regular that it matches the rhythm of the overhead belts, a long, steady pulse that seems to flow in and out without any effort on your part. The dark-haired woman has now emptied her tray of cut discs, the last few having been drilled and sorted and dropped into their proper bins, and she rises from her stool to collect the next tray from the transfer table, where a fresh batch of discs has been deposited by one of the cutters. She carries it back to her bench, the discs shifting slightly with each step, and she sets it down, adjusts her cap, and resumes her work without a word, without a glance around the room, simply settling back into her rhythm as if she had never left it. The trays will continue to come. The discs will continue to be drilled and sorted, and the finished bins will fill and be emptied and fill again, a cycle that will repeat until the end of the workday, when the last disc is sorted and the last bin is sealed, and the overhead belts slow to a stop, their humming fading into silence. But that is still hours away, and in the meantime there is only the quiet antis present of the work, the steady, soothing repetition of small, careful motions carried out in a room full of light and dust, and the gentle sound of nacre being shaped into usefulness. The long, quiet stretch of the midday hours settles over the factory like a slow, warm tide, and the rhythm of the work, which has been steady since the early morning, now deepens into something even more settled and unhurried, a pace that seems to flow from the building itself rather than from any individual effort. The sunlight, which earlier in the day fell in bright, slanting columns through the high north windows, has now shifted to a more vertical angle, the beams shortening and softening as the sun climbs toward its apex, and the quality of the light changes with it, losing the crisp golden edge of morning and taking on a flatter, more diffused character, a pale, even wash that fills every corner of the room and leaves no strong shadows anywhere. The dust in the air, which danced so visibly in the earlier beams, now floats in a fine suspended haze that is less noticeable but always present, a gentle milky tint to the atmosphere that softens the edges of the benches and the workers and the dark iron presses, giving the whole room the look of a photograph that has been slightly overexposed, its contrasts muted, its details blended. The temperature has risen by a few more degrees, not to the point of discomfort, but to a level that encourages a slower pace, a slight loosening of the collar, a more frequent reach for the tin cups of water that sit on the windowsills, their metal sides beaded with condensation that leave small, dark rings on the painted wood. You feel the warmth on your own skin. There's a pleasant, drowsy pressure, a heaviness that settles into your limbs and makes the simple act of standing and watching feel like a kind of rest, your weight shifting from one foot to the other, with the same slow, unconscious rhythm that governs the workers at their benches. The river, visible through the windows at the far end of the room as a distant strip of grey-blue light, seems to have slowed its flow in sympathy with the hour, its surface flat and gleaming under the noon sun, unbroken by any visible current, a motionless expanse that reflects the pale sky with the fidelity of old silver. Inside the factory, the sounds of the work continue without pause, but they too have taken on a midday quality, a slight slackening of tempo that is not a decrease in effort, but a natural accommodation to the warmth and the hour. Like the way a cricket's chirp slows as the night cools, though here the change is in reverse, the cutters and drills settling into a marginally slower, more measured pulse as the bodies that power them grow slightly heavy. With the accumulated hours of labor, the grinding of the cutting presses, which in the morning had a crisp, distinct character, now blends into a continuous rolling hum that seems to emanate from the walls and the floor rather than from any single source, a sound that you have grown so accustomed to that it has become a kind of silence, a background against which the smaller, closer sounds stand out in delicate relief. The creak of a stool as a worker shifts his weight, the soft clink of a wrench being set down on a wooden bench, the distant muffled golded as a rory, You watch a worker midway down the row of cutting presses pause in his rhythm and reach beneath his bench for a small glass bottle filled with a dark amber liquid, which he uncorks with a twist of his thumb and tips against a clean rag, the oil soaking into the fabric in a slow, spreading stain that darkens the cloth from tan to deep brown. He applies the rag to the shaft of his press with a few slow wiping motions, his hand moving up and down the dark metal in a steady, almost tender caress. And then he works the pedal several times to distribute the fresh oil, the press responding with a smoother, quieter stroke that seems to please him. For he nods once to himself and returns the bottle and rag to their places under the bench before resuming his cutting. This small maintenance, this act of care for the machine that enables his work, is performed with the same calm, unhurried attention that he gives to the shells themselves. And it reminds you that the relationship between the worker and his press is not one of master and servant, but of partnership, a quiet collaboration that depends on mutual attention and respect. At another bench, a worker has discovered a batch of shells that are more brittle than usual, perhaps from a mussel bed, where the water was slightly more acidic or the minerals slightly less abundant, and the discs he cuts from these shells occasionally fracture at the edges, leaving a small jagged chip rather than a clean circle. He does not grow frustrated or change his rhythm. He simply adjusts his technique, pressing the pedal with a lighter, more gradual pressure, allowing the cutter to bite more slowly through the fragile layers, and he examines each disc a moment longer before placing it in the tray, his quality control sharpening to meet the needs of the material. The chipped discs are not discarded entirely, but placed in a separate small bin, where they will later be reground into smaller sizes, salvaged for use as sleeve buttons or collar studs. For nothing in this factory is wasted, every fragment of nacre finding its way into some useful form, some small circle of pearlescent material that will fasten fabric somewhere in the world. The drilling benches, too, have settled into the deep rhythm of midday, the women working with a slightly slower, more deliberate pace than they did in the morning, their hands moving through the familiar sequence with the ease of long practice, but without the briskness of early energy. One of them has brought a small bunch of pale purple flowers, clover blossoms perhaps, or wild phlox, and set them in a chipped ceramic cup on the corner of her bench, and the sight of those flowers, so delicate and unexpected among the steel and wood and shell dust, adds a quiet note of gentleness to the room, a reminder that the workers bring their whole lives with them into the factory, their gardens and their kitchens and their quiet affections, and that the work is only one part of a larger, softer existence. The flowers bend slightly in the faint breeze from the vent, their stems bowing and straightening, their petals trembling with a motion so slight it is almost imperceptible, and the woman glances at them occasionally as she works, a brief, soft look that passes across her face like a shadow and is gone. You notice now that your own body has grown heavy and still, your back resting comfortably against the cool brick of the wall, your arms crossed loosely over your chest, your breathing so slow and deep that each inhale and exhale seems to take a full minute, the air moving in and out with the quiet regularity of the tide. Your gaze moves across the room without hurry, not focusing on any single point, but drifting from bench to bench, from worker to worker, from window to window, and you find that the scene has taken on the quality of a painting, a tableau of tranquil industry that could be hung in a gallery and studied for hours, each small detail revealing itself only to the patient observer. The way the dust has settled on the shoulders of the workers' aprons, the way a stray shaft of light catches the rim of a metal cup and throws a tiny dancing reflection onto the ceiling, the way a worker's hand hovers for a moment over the bin of shells before selecting one, as if the hand itself is making the choice without consulting the mind. All of these things are visible to you now with a clarity that comes not from a taunt, but from the soft unwottest of deep calm. The overhead belts continue their steady humming rotation, the leather straps moving in endless loops from the central shaft that runs the length of the ceiling, driven by a steam engine housed in a separate shed behind the main building, its rhythmic, distant thump-thump-thump, so low and regular that it has become part of the floor itself. A heartbeat that the building has always had and always will have. The pulleys turn in their brackets with a faint, continuous squeaking, each one singing its own tiny, high-pitched note, and the combined effect of these many small sounds is like the sound of a summer field at dusk, the chorus of insects and birds and rustling grasses that is not music but is nevertheless deeply musical, a harmony that requires no composer, that writes itself anew each moment, from the simple fact of many living things moving together in the same space. A man with a soft, round face and spectacles perched low on his nose, the floor supervisor, walks slowly down the center aisle, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze moving from bench to bench with a calm, benevolent attention that asks nothing and demands nothing, simply noting the state of the work, the fullness of the trays, the sharpness of the cutters, the overall rhythm of the room. He pauses now and then to exchange a few quiet words with a worker, his voice so low that you cannot hear the content, only the gentle, rumbling tone of it, and the worker responds with an equally quiet voice, their exchange brief and amicable, the supervisor nodding once before moving on, his footsteps creaking on the floorboards in a slow, measured cadence that matches the overall tempo of the hour. He reaches the end of the aisle, turns, and walks back the way he came, a slow circuit that he will repeat several more times before the day is done. A quiet, human counterpoint to the mechanical rhythm of the belts and pulleys. The smell of the factory has deepened as the day has grown warmer. The mineral dust and the machine oil joined now by the faint, savory scent of food, for some of the workers have brought their midday meals in tin pails and are eating at their benches, taking small, slow bites between cuts or drills, their jaws moving with the same steady rhythm as their hands. A worker near the window unwraps a piece of brown bread from a cloth napkin and eats it slowly, tearing off small pieces and chewing them thoroughly, his gaze directed out the window toward the river, where a barge is passing slowly upstream, its deck piled with lumber or coal, its tow rope slack in the current. Another worker sips soup from a small earthenware crock, the steam rising in a thin, fragrant curl that smells of beans and onions in a long, slow simmer, and he sets the crop down on the bench between shells, the warm food settling in his stomach and adding to the general drowsiness of the hour. You realize that you are hungry yourself, not sharply but distantly, a mild, pleasant sensation that you can observe without acting on, and you let it be, returning your attention to the room. The afternoon has begun its slow descent toward evening, that the end of the workday is still several hours away, and the light, which has been steady for so long, now begins its gradual, imperceptible shift toward the warmer tones of late day, the first hint of gold returning to the edges of the shadows, the first faint lengthening of the sunbeams as they stretch across the floor. The workers feel this change without looking at a clock, their bodies are tuned to the passage of the sun through the windows, and there is a barely perceptible quickening of the rhythm, not a hurry, but a gentle increase, like the way a stream speeds up just slightly as it approaches a bend. The trays of discs are fuller now, the bins of waste shells are heavier, and the day has accumulated in the bodies of the workers as a pleasant, satisfying tiredness, the kind of tiredness that comes from steady, useful work, done in a steady, useful way. A tiredness that will make the evening rest all the sweeter for having been earned. You shift your weight again, settling more deeply against the wall, and you let your eyes close for a long, slow moment, listening to the factory with the whole of your attention, the sound washing over you in waves that seem to rise and fall with your own breathing. The grinding, the creaking, the humming, the rustling, all of it blends together into a single sustained chord that holds you suspended, weightless and still, in the warm, dusty air of the afternoon. And you feel for this moment that you are not separate from the factory but part of it, another quiet component in a large, quiet machine, your presence as natural and unremarkable as the dust on the floorboards. Your thoughts as slow and patient as the river that continues its endless flow beyond the window, carrying silt and shells, and the failed that would fade the waste fragments from the cutting benches, the hollow rings of shell with their neat circular holes, and the odd irregular pieces that broke during the cut or were trimmed away as too small, are gathered up throughout the afternoon by a young man who moves quietly from bench to bench with a large empty burlap sack slung over his shoulder, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the worn pine floor. He stops at each cutting station, lifting the waste bin with both hands and tilting it carefully into the sack, the fragments sliding out in a dry, clattering rush that lasts only a second or two before the bin is empty and set back in its place. And then he moves on to the next bench, the sack growing heavier against his shoulder with each stop. The fragments inside the sack settle against one another, with a sound like broken crockery wrapped in thick cloth, a soft, muffled clinking that follows the young man's movements down the aisle, and you watch him pause occasionally to shift the weight, to adjust his grip on the coarse burlap, before continuing his slow circuit. When the sack is full, its sides bulging with the sharp edges and curved pieces of spent shell, he ties the top with a length of frayed twine, pulling the knot tight with a quick, practiced motion, and then he drags the sack across the floor toward the side door, the burlap whispering against the wood, leaving a faint trail of shell dust that will be swept up later. Outside, the air is warmer than the factory interior, the sun still high enough to cast a pleasant, drowsy heat across the packed earth of the yard, and the young man hauls the sack a short distance to a growing mound near the river's edge, a heap of discarded shells that has been accumulating in this spot for years, its shape always changing yet always present, a slow, patient monument to the work done inside the brick building. He unties the twine, opens the mouth of the sack, and with a careful heave tips the contents onto the pile, the fragments cascading down the slope in a brief, glittering tumble, catching the afternoon light in 1,000 tiny flashes of pink and cream and pale silver, before coming to rest among the older, duller pieces that have already begun their long return to the earth. The sound of the fall is a dry, brittle music, a rushing clatter that fades quickly into silence, and then the young man shakes the empty sack to dislodge the remaining dust, folds it loosely over his arm, and walks back toward the factory door, leaving the pile to its quiet, sunlit repose. The waste heap itself, when you turn your attention fully to it, is not an ugly thing, but a strangely gentle presence, its contours softened by time and weather, its surface a patchwork of broken shells in every stage of fading and decay. The freshest fragments, those added today and in the past few days, still carry a faint gleam of nacre on their inner faces, the rainbow luster catching the light in brief, watery flashes that wink and disappear as the sun moves behind a cloud and then re-emerges. The older pieces, those that have lain on the pile for weeks or months, have begun to lose that inner brilliance, their nacre dulling to a matte, chalky white, their edges rounding and softening, the sharp breaks left by the cutting press slowly worn away by rain and frost, and the gentle abrasion of their own weight shifting against itself. And at the very bottom of the pile, half buried in the soft mud of the riverbank, are the oldest fragments of all. Pieces that have been here for years, their shapes reduced to small, rounded pebbles, their nacre entirely gone, leached away by water and time, leaching only the dull, porous matrix of the shell, a material that crumbles easily between finger and thumb and is slowly becoming part of the soil itself. You walk a few steps closer, your shoes pressing into the grass that grows in sparse, tough clumps around the edge of the pile, and you kneel down to look more closely at the surface of the heap, your breathing slow and even in the warm, still air. The fragments nearest you are of varying sizes, some as large as a spoon bowl, others no bigger than a thumbnail, and they lie jumbled together at every possible angle, their shapes intersecting in a random three-dimensional mosaic that the eye can trace for a long time without ever finding a pattern. A piece shaped like a crescent moon rests against a thin, jagged triangle. A perfect ring, the outer frame of a button disc, sits nestled in a bed of smaller fragments, its empty center holding a tiny pool of trapped rainwater from an earlier shower, the water catching the sky in a miniature reflection of pale blue and drifting white cloud. The colors of the fragments, even the dullest among them, hold a quiet beauty, the browns and grays of the outer shells blending with the creamy whites and faded pinks of the inner nacre, the whole surface of the pile presenting a subdued, earthy palette that seems to belong naturally to the riverbank, as if the waste shells were always meant to be here, were simply returning to a place they had never truly left. The sun moves slowly across the western sky, and the angle of its light shifts the appearance of the pile with each passing quarter hour, the shadows deepening on one side while the opposite slope catches a wash of warm golden illumination, the kind of light that makes even the most ordinary things look soft and precious. A few of the fragments, those with a remaining trace of thick nacre, glow with a faint internal fire, a pale opalescence that seems to radiate from within the shell rather than from the sun's reflection, a last lingering gift of the mussel's long labor of layering calcium and protein into something beautiful. You let your gaze rest on one such fragment, a curved piece no larger than a coin. Its inner surface a swirl of pale green and rose, the colors shifting as you tilt your head, and you think of the muscle that made this nacre, layer upon layer, year upon year, in the dim, cool water of the river. A patient, silent life that has now, in its broken form, come to rest on a sunny bank above the very water that shaped it. Silent life that has now, in its broken form, come to rest on a silently. The thought is not sad but peaceful, a recognition of the long, slow cycles that move through the world without hurry, the cycles in which nothing is ever truly lost, but only changed, softened, returned. As you remain there, kneeling in the grass, the afternoon breeze stirs gently, a breath of air that moves up from the river and across the waste pile, and with it comes the smell of the heap, a dry, clean scent of old shell and warm earth, with just a faint, mineral undertone of the river itself. The breeze ruffles the surface of a small puddle that has collected in a depression on the pile's top, the water shivering into tiny concentric ripples that spread and vanish and spread again, and then the breeze dies away. The puddle returns to stillness, and the only sound is the distant hum of the factory belts, muffled by the brick walls, and the closer, softer murmur of the factory belts, muffled by the brick walls, and the closer, softer murmur of the Mississippi as it continues its endless, patient slide past the bank. You notice at the very edge of the pile where the fragments meet the mud, a small, delicate plant has found a foothold, its thin green stem rising a few inches above the shells, its tiny white flowers open to the sun, and you think of the seed that must have blown here on some earlier wind, landing in a crevice filled with the fine dust of ground shell, and finding, against all probability, enough nourishment to grow and bloom in this quiet, forgotten corner of the factory yard. The plant sways gently, its petals trembling, and it seems to you like a small, living flag of peace, a sign that the heap of waste is not a place of ending, but of transformation, where the old shapes give way to new ones, where the mussel shells become the soil for a flower. Time passes without measure as you watch the pile, the sun slipping lower, the shadows growing longer, and you observe how the light changes the character of the fragments. The afternoon gold giving way to a softer, more amber tone, the colors deepening, the contrasts mellowing, until the whole heap seems to glow with a warm honeyed radiance that makes it look less like a discard pile and more like a strange, accidental sculpture. A piece of natural art that has been made by no single hand, but by the slow confablicani. A single bird, a small brown sparrow, flits down from the branches of a nearby willow and lands on the apex of the pile, its tiny claws gripping a projecting shell edge, and it looks around with quick, jerky movements of its head, its bright black eye catching the light for a moment before it hops to another spot, pecking once at something unseen, and then flies away, its wings making a soft, whirring sound that fades quickly into the general quiet. The pile is visited by birds often, you imagine, and by field mice at night, and by the occasional curious dog from the town, each creature finding in the heap something of interest. A bit of grit for digestion, a shiny object to carry away, a warm spot to rest and then leaving it as they found it, undisturbed in its essential stillness. You think about the longer story of the waste heap, the way it has grown slowly over the years, the early fragments now buried deep beneath the newer ones, pressed down by weight and softened by groundwater and the freeze and thaw of many winters, their sharp edges worn away, their forms crumbling into smaller and smaller pieces, until the oldest fragments at the very bottom, a mixture of calcium carbonate, and mixture of calcium carbonate, and mixture of calcium carbonate, and mixture of the calcium carbonate, it is bad to slowly away. In the spring, when the river rises with the melting snow from up north, the water sometimes laps at the lower edge of the pile, soaking into the fragments, dissolving tiny amounts of the shell material, and then retreating, leaving the pile a little smaller, a little more compact, a little more integrated with the shore. In the summer, the sun bakes the upper layers, drying them to a pale, dusty whiteness, and the heat expands and contracts the fragments, causing tiny cracks to form and widen, so that the whole pile is always shifting, always settling, sinking by imperceptible degrees into the earth that will eventually receive it completely. In the autumn, falling leaves from the willow and the cottonwoods along the bank drift down onto the heap, covering it with a thin, temporary blanket of golden brown. The leaves drying and crumbling and adding their own small contribution of organic matter to the mix. And in the winter, when the temperature drops and the ground hardens, the pile lies dormant under a thin crust of frost or a light dusting of snow, the fragments locked together by ice, the whole heap silent and still, waiting for the thaw that will start the slow work of dissolution all over again. This patient, endless cycle of weathering and settling and fading is not something that anyone in the factory thinks about consciously. The waste pile is simply there, a fact of the yard, a place where the young man dumps his sack and then walks away. But standing here now with the sun lowering toward the tree line and the first faint hint of evening coolness touching the air, you feel the deep, quiet presence of this slow process, the way it mirrors the even slower processes that created the shells in the first place. The filtering of calcium from the river water, the laying down of nacre layer by layer, the years of patient growth on the riverbed, and you understand that the pile is not an end, but a continuation, a return of borrowed materials to their source, a quindrum batit mankenbel and plate keys but from it would come off fabake. The mussels took their substance from the river, and the river, in its own time, is taking it back, one rainstorm, one frost, one gentle lap of water at a time. And there is no hurry in this transaction, no urgency, only the same patient steady rhythm that governs all the deep, lasting things of the world. The light continues to fade, the amber glow deepening to a richer, more somber gold, the shadows stretching out from the base of the pile like long dark fingers pointing toward the river. And you become aware that you have been kneeling here for a long while, your knees pressed into the cool grass, your hands resting loosely in your lap, your breathing so slow and regular that it has become part of the landscape, no more obtrusive than the breeze or the river's murmur. You rise slowly, your joints stiff from the stillness, and you stand looking at the pile one last time before you turn away, noticing how the evening light has transformed the fragments once again, the nacre now glowing with a soft, ghostly luminescence, a pale, cool fire that seems to belong to the coming night, a last quiet display before the darkness covers everything. The pile will be here tomorrow, receiving its new burden of waste, and the day after that, and the month after that, slowly growing and slowly diminishing all at once, a quiet, patient presence on the riverbank, a place of rest for the broken shells and, you think, a place of rest for the mind that takes the time to stop and observe it. You turn toward the factory, where the work continues at its steady, quiet pace, and you carry with you the image of the pile, the soft glint of the fading nacre, the tiny white flower blooming among the fragments, the bird's brief visit, and you let the memory settle into your thoughts like one more fragment in a vast, quiet heap of impressions, there to be revisited in dreams. The light has shifted unmistakably now, the long golden rays of late afternoon giving way to a softer, dimmer glow that slants through the high windows at a lower angle, its color deepening toward amber and rose, and the workers, without needing to consult any clock, begin the slow, quiet process of shutting down their stations for the evening. There is no bell that rings in the factory, no whistle that blows to signal the end of the workday, for the owner long ago decided that such noises were jarring and unpleasant, disruptive to the calm rhythm of the shop, and so the transition from work to rest happens gradually, organically, each worker finishing the last few shells in his bin and then beginning the familiar sequence of tidying and cleaning that will leave the benches ready for the next morning. You watch this transition from your place by the wall, your body still heavy with the long stillness of the afternoon, and you feel the mood of the room shift in subtle, quiet ways, the focus of the day loosening into the ease of the evening, the concentration softening into a gentle, tired satisfaction. The sand-haired worker, whose bin of shells has been empty for some time now, has already begun his evening routine, starting with the shallow wooden tray of cut discs, which he lifts carefully from the bench and carries to the transfer table at the far end of the room, where it will be collected by the drillers for tomorrow's work. He places the tray down with a soft, precise motion, aligning it with the other trays that have been deposited by the other cutters, a neat row of pale, shimmering circles that will rest here through the night, covered by a clean cloth to keep the dust from settling on their surfaces. Returning to his bench, he takes up a small hand broom from a hook on the side of the bench leg, its bristles worn to a soft angled edge, and he begins to sweep the surface of the bench with long, unhurried strokes, gathering the fine shell dust and the tiny fragments that have accumulated over the course of the day into a small, neat pile at the front edge. The broom makes a soft, whisking sound against the wood, a sound that is different from any of the day's working noises, quieter and more domestic, the sound of a kitchen being tidied after a meal or a hearth being swept before bed, and it adds a new, gentle note to the soundscape of the factory as other brooms join it, one by one, down the length of the rows. He sweeps the dust pile into one cupped hand, tilting the edge of the bench carefully so that nothing spills, and then he walks to a small dustbin near the side door and drops the dust in, brushing his hands together lightly to remove the last fine coating, a small, habitual gesture that he has performed thousands of times. Back at his bench, he takes the waste bin, now emptied earlier by the young man with the burlap sack, and he wipes its interior with a damp rag drawn from a pail of water that sits near the door, the rag coming away grey with the residue of shell mud and river silt, and he rinses the rag in the pail, wrings it out with a firm, twisting motion, and hangs it over the edge of the pail to dry. The burlap liner is straightened, any clinging fragments shaken loose into the dustbin, and then the waste bin is replaced under the left side of the bench, ready for the fresh shells that will arrive on tomorrow's wagon. The cutting press itself receives its own attention now, a careful, methodical cleaning that begins with a dry rag to wipe away the loose dust from the shaft and the base plate, followed by a lightly oiled rag that is drawn slowly down the length of the shaft, leaving behind a thin, protective film that gleams faintly in the fading light. The cutter, removed from its housing with a few turns of a wrench, is examined for dullness or damage, its teeth inspected in the light from the window, and then it is either set aside for sharpening by the factory's toolman or replaced in its housing, the bolts tightened to the proper tension with the same calm, precise motions that guide all the work in this room. The pedal is wiped clean of the day's dust, and the hinge is given a single drop of oil from the small glass bottle, the oil running down into the joint with a slow amber bead, and then the pedal is worked once, twice, to distribute the lubrication before the worker steps back and surveys his bench with a quiet, satisfied nod. Around him, the other cutters are performing the same rituals, each at his own pace, some slightly faster, some slightly slower, but all moving through the same sequence of tray delivery, sweeping, wiping, oiling, and checking. A choreography of evening that is as practiced and as comforting as the work itself. The sounds of the factory have changed character entirely now, the grinding of the cutters and the whine of the drills replaced by the soft whisk of brooms, the gentle clink of tools being put away, the low murmur of voices as workers exchange a few quiet words about the day or the weather or the plans for the evening ahead. The overhead belts, which have been humming steadily since the first worker pressed the first pedal in the early morning, begin to slow as the steam engine in the shed is gradually throttled down, their motion becoming visible, the leather straps sagging slightly between the pulleys, and then they stop entirely, the last faint squeak of a bearing fading into silence. The sudden absence of that deep, continuous hum is almost startling, a hole in the soundscape that your ears must adjust to, and in the new quiet, the smaller, closer sounds take on a crispness and clarity that they did not have before. The footsteps on the floorboards, the closing of a cabinet door, the distant high call of a bird from the trees along the riverbank. The drilling benches at the far end of the room are closing down in their own parallel rhythm, the women covering their finished bins with snug wooden lids, wiping their drill bits with a soft dry cloth to remove any lingering shell dust, and emptying the small water cups that held their flowers back into a larger pail for disposal. The sorting trays are cleared of the last few discs, each one tested and placed into its proper bin, and then the trays are stacked neatly on a shelf above the benches, their circular depressions catching the evening light in a regular geometric pattern. The flowers in the chipped ceramic cup are lifted carefully and carried to the window, where they will catch the last of the daylight before the cup is taken home, and the cup itself is rinsed with a splash of water that gleams briefly in the air before disappearing into the pail. The women gather their shawls and their lunch tins, their movements quiet and unhurried, and they walk together in small groups toward the side door, their low voices blending with the rustle of their skirts and the soft tread of their shoes on the pine floor a gentle feminine note that has been present all day but is now more noticeable in the general quieting of the room. The floor supervisor makes his final circuit of the day, walking slowly down the center aisle with his hands still clasped behind his back, his spectacles glinting in the amber light, and he stops at each bench for a brief word with the worker there. A quiet acknowledgement of the day's labor, a checking of the supplies or the condition of the tools, a small human exchange that marks the official end of the work period. His voice, when you can hear it, is low and calm, a deep, unhurried murmur that seems to wrap up the day like a blanket being folded, and the workers respond in similarly low tones, their conversations lasting only a few seconds before the supervisor nods and moves on to the next bench. He reaches the far end of the room, turns, and walks back along the other row, completing the circuit, and then he goes to the main door, where he pauses to look back over the room one last time, his gaze moving across the clean benches, the covered trays, the neat rows of tools, the settling dust in the still amber air, and his face, lit from the side by the window glow, bears an expression of quiet, unremarkable contentment. The workers begin to leave now, singly and in pairs, pulling on their hats and their coats, carrying their lunch pails and their small personal belongings, and they step out through the side door into the cool, fresh air of the early evening, their footsteps fading down the cobblestone street toward the boarding houses and the family homes that cluster on the hillside above the river. Their voices, which were low and muted inside the factory, rise slightly as they greet the outside world. A brief, soft exchange of goodbyes and see you tomorrows that hangs in the air for a moment, and then disperses, blending into the general murmur of the town at dusk. You watch them go, the last of the drillers, the last of the cutters, the young man who hauled the waste sacks now pulling on a light jacket and whistling a low, tuneless note through his teeth. And then the factory is nearly empty, the room settling into its nighttime stillness like a large animal sinking into sleep. The floor supervisor remains for a few more minutes, attending to the final duties of the day, the closing of the windows and the checking of the stove and the locking of the supply cabinet, and you watch him move through these tasks with the same calm, measured pace that has characterized every action in the factory since the early morning. He closes each window with a firm, steady pull, the sash descending with a soft thud into its frame, the sound repeating at regular intervals as he moves along the wall, the room becoming quieter with each closure as the outside sounds the river, the birds, the distant murmur of the town are shut out, replaced by a deep, enclosed hush that seems to press gently against your ears. The last window closes, the last latch is secured, and the supervisor walks to the main door, where he pauses to light a small oil lamp that hangs on a hook beside the entrance, the flame catching with a soft yellow bloom that casts a warm flickering glow across the nearest benches, the only light now that the daylight has faded to a deep, dusky blue outside. He holds the lamp up for a moment, surveying the room one final time, and then he steps through the door and pulls it closed behind him with a gentle, solid thud that echoes briefly in the high-ceiling space. The bolt slides into place with a metallic scrape, a sound that carries a note of finality. The day's work officially concluded, the factory sealed and sleeping until the morning light returns. You remain where you are for a long moment, alone in the quiet room. The only light, the faint golden glow that seeps through the gaps around the door, and the soft, diffuse luminescence of the evening sky through the high windows, a pale silvery blue that is just bright enough to distinguish the shapes of the benches and the presses, their dark forms standing in patient, silent rows like sentinels awaiting the dawn. The air is still and cool, the dust fully settled, the smell of shells and oil and wood hanging in the silence like a memory, and you breathe it in slowly, one last time, before you turn and walk toward the side door that the workers used. Your footsteps the only sound in the vast empty room. Outside, the evening air wraps around you with a coolness that is refreshing after the long warm hours inside, and you pause for a moment on the cobblestone street, looking up at the sky where the first stars are beginning to appear. Faint, pale points of light in the deepening blue. The river is a dark, moving presence beyond the factory yard, its surface catching the last light of the western sky in a single, long streak of silver that stretches from bank to bank and the sound of its flow, which you have not heard consciously for many hours, returns to you now with a freshness that is almost like hearing it for the first time, a low, continuous murmur that seems to carry the accumulated quiet of the entire day within it. A single gas lamp flickers to life on the corner of 2nd Street, its flame a small, wavering point of gold in the dusk, and by its light you can see the empty shell wagon still parked beside the factory wall, its bed bare, its horse long since led away to the stable. The wagon itself waiting with the stable tame, the wagon itself waiting with the same patient stillness that the building holds, ready for the next day's journey to the riverbank. You begin to walk, not with any particular destination in mind, but simply moving with the slow, easy pace that the evening invites. Your feet carrying you down the familiar slope toward the river, the cobblestones gradually giving way to packed earth, and then to the soft grass of the bank. The air cools further as you approach the water, the temperature dropping by a few noticeable degrees, and the smell of the river rises up to meet you. That clean, mineral scent of fresh water and wet mud, and the faint green perfume of the willows that trail their leaves into the current. A smell that you remember from the dawn, from the beginning of the day that is now ending, and the symmetry of it feels like a closing, a gentle circular return to the place where you started. You stop at the edge of the bank, near the spot where you stood in the misty first light, and you look out across the darkening river, its surface now a deep, muted grey that is almost black in the center, the far shore lost in the gathering darkness, the sky above fading through 1,000 subtle shades of blue and purple, and the faintest, palest orange at the horizon where the sun has long since set. The day is done, the factory is silent. The shells are resting in their bins and their soaking tanks and their quiet crumbling pile by the water's edge, and you feel, settling over you like a soft, heavy quilt, the deep, calm tiredness that comes from a day spent in quiet observation, a tiredness that has nothing to do with exertion, and everything to do with exertion, and everything to do with peace. The boarding house stands on a quiet side street, a short walk from the factory, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch and a row of dormer windows set into the sloping roof, its white paint softened by the evening dusk to a pale, silvery grey that blends with the gathering darkness. You climb the 3 wooden steps to the porch, your feet heavy with the pleasant tiredness of the long day, and the boards creak under your weight with a low, familiar note that seems to welcome you, the sound of a house settling into its own nighttime rhythm. The front door is unlocked, as it always is, and you push it open with a gentle pressure of your palm, stepping into a narrow hallway lit by a single oil lamp mounted on a wall bracket, its flame turned low so that it casts only a soft golden pool of light that reaches a few feet in every direction before fading into amber shadow. The hallway smells of beeswax and old wood, and the faint, distant trace of the evening meal that was cooked and eaten hours ago, a smell that is comforting in its ordinariness, the smell of a place where many people have lived quiet, simple lives. You walk slowly down the hallway, your footsteps muffled by a long, worn runner of braided rag cloth that stretches the length of the floor, its colors faded to a uniform, dusty brown, and you pass the closed doors of other boarders, each one silent, each one with a thin line of lamplight or darkness visible at the threshold, small clues to the presence of sleeping or reading or quiet contemplation within. The house is still but not entirely silent. There is the soft, rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock somewhere on the ground floor, its pendulum swinging with a steady, ancient motion, and there is the faint, distant murmur of the river that you can hear through the slightly open window at the end of the hall, a sound so constant and so soft that it has become part of the house itself, as much a feature of the building as its walls or its roof. You reach the narrow staircase at the back of the hall and begin to climb, your hand resting lightly on the smooth, polished banister that has been worn to a dark, glossy patina by the touch of countless hands before yours, the wood cool and solid under your palm. The stairs creak under your weight, each step producing its own small, musical note, a little ascending scale of wooden sounds that marks your progress upward, and you climb slowly, without hurry, feeling the day's accumulated stillness settling more deeply into your bones with each step. At the top of the stairs, a small landing opens onto a short corridor with 2 doors, and you turn to the left, opening the door to your room with a gentle push that makes the hinges give a soft, well-oiled sigh. a sound of quiet welcome that you have heard every night since you first arrived in Muscatine. The room is small and simple, with a single window set into the wall that faces the river, and through that window, which is open a few inches, the cool night air enters in a slow, continuous drift, carrying with it the smell of water and damp earth, and the faint green scent of the willow leaves that rustle softly in the darkness outside. The window curtain, a plain, cream-colored piece of muslin, stirs gently in the breeze, lifting and falling with a motion so slow and so regular that it seems to breathe in time with the river itself. You close the door behind you with a soft click of the latch, and you stand for a long moment in the center of the room, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness, letting the quiet wrap around you like a cool, clean sheet. The room contains only a few simple pieces of furniture, a narrow bed pushed against the wall beneath the window, its frame made of dark, turned wood, its mattress covered with a quilt of faded blue and white patches arranged in a pattern of interlocking rings, each stitch sewn by some patient hand long before you arrived. Beside the bed, a small wooden table holds a ceramic basin and a pitcher of water, a clean towel folded neatly beside them, and a single candle in a tin holder, unlit now, its wick a pale curved line against the metal. Against the opposite wall stands a plain pine wardrobe, with a single door and a small oval mirror set into its front, the mirror catching the last faint light from the window and reflecting it back as a dim, silvery glow, like a pool of still water seen in the darkness. There is a chair, too, a simple wooden chair with a woven rush seat, pushed under a small writing table that is bare except for a single, unread book whose spine is cracked and whose pages are yellowed with age, and in the corner, near the door, a small iron stove, unlit in the mild spring weather, its flue pipe disappearing into the wall. You move through the room with the slow, automatic motions of a familiar routine, first removing your shoes and setting them side by side near the door, the leather cool and slightly damp from the evening grass, and then pouring a small amount of water from the pitcher into the basin, the water making a soft musical sound as it splashes against the ceramic, a sound that seems louder than it should in the deep quiet of the room. You wash your hands and face with slow, gentle movements, the cool water lifting away the faint, dusty residue of the factory, the fine shell powder that has settled on your skin over the course of the day, and you dry yourself with the towel, its fabric soft and slightly rough against your cheeks, smelling of laundry soap and fresh air. The simple act of washing feels like a small ritual of transition, a washing away of the waking hours, a preparation for the long, deep rest that waits. You unbutton your shirt slowly and hang it over the back of the wooden chair, the fabric still carrying a faint trace of the factory's smell, that blend of shell dust and machine oil and aged wood, and you change into a soft, worn nightshirt of plain cotton, its texture smooth and familiar against your skin. Then you walk to the window, placing your hands on the sill, and you look out into the night, one last time, your breath making a small, faint cloud on the glass. The river is visible as a dark, moving presence beyond the line of trees, its surface catching the light of a few early stars in tiny, scattered points of silver, and the sound of its flow, that low, constant murmur, rises up to you like a lullaby that has been playing softly in the background of the entire day. A single light glimmers on the far bank, perhaps a lantern in a fisherman's shack or the window of a farmhouse set back among the fields, and it burns with a steady, warm glow, a tiny, distant companion in the vast, dark landscape. The trees on the bank are barely visible, their shapes massed together in a solid, undifferentiated darkness, and the sky above them is a deep, velvety blue-black scattered with stars that seem to grow brighter the longer you look. Each one a small, patient point of light that has been shining for millions of years. You close the window gently, leaving it open just a crack, enough to let the river's voice continue to drift into the room. And then you turn toward the bed, folding back the quilt with a slow, careful motion, the fabric rustling softly in the quiet. The sheets beneath are cool and smooth, made of plain white cotton that has been washed many times, and the pillow, when you lower your head onto it, gives way with a gentle, yielding softness that seems to cradle the back of your skull, the curve of your neck, in a perfect, weightless support. You pull the quilt up over your body, feeling its weight settle across your shoulders and your chest and your legs. A weight that is neither heavy nor light, but exactly right, the weight of a covering that has been designed for nothing more than comfort, and you let out a long, slow breath that seems to empty your lungs completely, the exhale lasting far longer than you thought it could. And with it goes the last, faint residue of tension that you were not even aware you were carrying. You lie on your back with your arms at your sides, your hands resting loosely on the quilt, your legs straight and slightly apart, and you feel the mattress beneath you adjust to the shape of your body, the horsehair stuffing compressing in some places and rising in others, creating a custom, gentle cradle that holds you in a position of absolute stillness. Your eyes, which you close now with a slow, deliberate lowering of the lids, feel heavy and warm, the muscles around them releasing fully for the first time all day, and the darkness behind your eyelids is not an empty black but a soft, velvety grey that seems to stretch away into infinity, a space that is vast and calm and entirely peaceful. You bring your attention to your breathing, not changing it in any way, simply observing the natural rhythm that has been there all along beneath your awareness, the slow rise and fall of your chest, the gentle expansion and contraction of your ribs, the faint whisper of air passing through your nostrils with each inhale and exhale, a sound so quiet that it blends with the river's murmur, the two sounds becoming one, a single, continuous breath that moves through you and through the world with distinction. The day's impressions drift through your mind in a slow, haphazard procession, not as coherent memories but as fragments, images that float up and dissolve like the dust motes in the factory's sunbeams. You see the river at dawn, a flat, grey expanse of water, with mist rising from its surface in thin, ghostly tendrils, and then the image shifts, and you see the mussel beds below, the shells resting half-buried in the silt, their inner nacre glowing with a dim, underwater light. The shell wagon rattles softly across your thoughts, its canvas cover folded back, the horse stamping a hoof on the cobblestones, and then you see the interior of the factory, the long rows of benches, the tall windows filled with north light, the workers bent over their presses in their canvas aprons, their hands moving through the familiar, rhythmic dance of the cutting. You hear, in the distance of your remembering, the steady grinding of the cutters, the high, thin whine of the drills, the rustle of discs dropping into wooden trays, the soft whisk of brooms at the end of the day. And these sounds do not disturb your slide towards sleep, but rather guide it, a gentle, familiar soundtrack that your mind has absorbed so deeply that it has become part of your own internal rhythm. The image of the waste pile drifts into your thoughts, the heap of broken shells glowing faintly in the late afternoon light, the tiny white flower blooming among the fragments, the sparrow landing and looking around with its bright, quick eye, and you feel, in your half-dreaming state, a sense of deep, quiet connection to that pile, to its slow, patient dissolution, to the way it is returning bit by bit to the earth and the river, becoming again what it was before the mussels drew the calcium from the water and built their paled bale. The circle of the day feels complete in your mind, the dawn river and the evening river, the full shell and the empty tray of discs, the waking and the sleeping, all of it, one continuous gentle movement that requires no effort from you, that simply flows on and on like the Mississippi itself, carrying everything with it in its patient, ancient current. Your body has grown heavier now, sinking into the mattress with a deep, weightless sensation, and the boundary between your skin and the sheets, between your breath and the night air, between your thoughts and the darkness, has begun to soften and blur, the edges dissolving like the mist on the river at sunrise. The river's murmur, which has been a constant presence in the background of your awareness, now seems to move closer, filling the room with its low, continuous sound, and you feel as if you are floating on that sound, being carried downstream on a current of pure, dark quiet, the water bearing you gently past sleeping towns and dark forests and wide, empty fields, past the factory and the shell beds and the waste pile, past the waking world, and into the deep, uncharted country of sleep. Your breathing has slowed to a pace that is almost imperceptible, the rise and fall of your chest so shallow that the quilt barely moves, and your heartbeat, which you can feel as a faint, steady pulse in your ears, has settled into a rhythm that matches the ticking of the grandfather clock, the pendulum swinging, the seconds passing, each one carrying you a little further from the shore of consciousness. The last image that drifts through your mind before the darkness closes over you completely is of the pearl button discs resting in their sorting tray. Hundreds of pale, perfect circles gleaming with a soft, watery light, each one unique in its shade and its pattern, each one the product of a long, patient process that began years ago on the riverbed and will continue tomorrow in the factory. A process that has no real beginning and no real end. That it is simply one of the many quiet, steady timkat the image holds for a moment, shimmering softly in the darkness behind your closed eyes, and then it fades, dissolving into the grey, into the quiet, into the deep, slow breath that carries you at last, without effort and without thought, into sleep.